You are in northern England in the year 1348, living as a peasant in a small hamlet under the shadow of Lord Blackwood's castle. Winter has arrived earlier than expected, and it will be the harshest in living memory. The scream pierced the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Eliza from her fitful sleep. Not a human screamed the wind. It howled through the cracks of their humble hut like a wounded beast, carrying with it tiny daggers of ice that stung any exposed skin. Eliza pulled the ragged woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold had already seeped into her bones, a familiar companion that would not leave until spring's distant return. The fire, she whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. Her husband Thomas had not stirred beside her, exhaustion from yesterday's labour claiming him completely. 3 children slumbered nearby, their small bodies huddled together atop a thin mattress stuffed with old straw. At the far corner of their one-room dwelling, her elderly father-in-law coughed in his sleep, a wet, rattling sound that had worsened with each passing night. Eliza slid from the makeshift bed, little more than a wooden frame elevated slightly from the packed earth. Florand winced as her bare feet touched the freezing ground. The embers in the central hearth had dimmed to a dull orange glow, barely offering any heat to combat the merciless cold that had descended upon their village. If the fire died completely, they might not survive until morning. She crouched by the hearth, her fingers stiff and clumsy as she carefully arranged the precious kindling. Wood was scarce now. Lord Blackwood had forbidden them from taking anything. But fallen branches from his forests, and those had been quickly claimed in the days following the first frost. What remained was damp and reluctant to burn. Eliza leaned forward, blowing gently on the embers, coaxing them back to life with whispered prayers and the desperation of a mother who had already buried 2 children in previous winters. "Is it dawn yet?" Thomas's voice, thick with sleep, came from behind her. "Not for hours," Eliza replied, not turning from her task. "The storm has worsened. I fear for the roof." As if in response, a violent gust rattled the thatched ceiling above them, sending a shower of ice particles through the gaps. Their home, a simple structure of wattle and daub, with walls no thicker than Eliza's forearm, offered little protection against nature as fury. During autumn, they had patched the walls with fresh mud mixed with straw and animal dung, but the early freeze had prevented them from completing the repairs. Now, wind whistled through dozens of tiny crevices, bringing with it the bone-chilling cold that no amount of huddling could fully dispel. A thin cry rose from the children's corner. Little Agnes, barely 4 years old, had awakened. "Mama, I am cold," she whimpered. "Come here, my sweet," Eliza called softly, finally coaxing a small flame from the embers. "Come sit by the fire while Mama builds it up." Agnes toddled over, wrapped in a small blanket that had once been part of Eliza's wedding clothes, now repurposed for the 3rd time. Her tiny face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. Eliza pulled her daughter close, sharing what little body heat she could offer. "Tell me a story," Agnes pleaded, her small body shivering against Eliza's side. "Tell me about the summer." Eliza smiled, despite their dire circumstances. "Once there was a little girl who danced in meadows of wildflowers under a sun so warm it kissed her cheeks pink," she began, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "The grass beneath her feet was soft and green, and berries grew, fat and sweet on bushes that stretched as far as she could see. ... As she spun tales of warmth and abundance, Eliza worked methodically to build up the fire. adding tiny sticks and bits of dried moss she had collected and stored for emergencies such as this. Each piece was precious, carefully placed to extract maximum heat. Behind her, Thomas had risen and was now inspecting the roof, where the thatching had begun to sag dangerously under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. "We will need to reinforce it tomorrow," he said grimly, "if the weather allows." Eliza nodded, though they both knew what remained unspoken. If the roof collapsed, they would have nowhere else to go. The village church could shelter a few families, but it was already overcrowded with those whose homes had proven insufficient against the early onslaught of winter. A sudden gust caused the flame to flicker violently, nearly extinguishing Eliza's hard work. She cupped her hands around it protectively, as if shielding a newborn from harm. In this moment, this fragile fire was just as precious to their survival. "Will we die like Sarah and baby William?" Agnes asked suddenly, her innocent question striking Eliza's heart like a physical blow. "No, sweet one," Eliza assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at her confidence. "We are stronger now. We know better ways to keep warm." She did not mention that Sarah had succumbed to a fever, not directly to the cold, nor that William had been born too early and too small to survive his first winter. Some truths were too harsh for a child's ears. Outside, an animal perhaps, a fox or a desperate wolf, driven closer to human dwellings by hunger, let out a mournful cry that seemed to echo Eliza's own unspoken fears. The longest nights of the year stretched before them, each one a battle against the elements with weapons as meager as their stores of food. Thomas joined them by the fire, bringing with him the heavy odor of unwashed bodies and the smoky scent that clung to all their clothing. "Tomorrow I will see if Oswald still has those sheep pelts he promised to trade," he said. "We can hang them over the windows to keep more of the draft out." Eliza nodded, not mentioning that they had little left to trade. Their autumn harvest had been meager, with barely enough turnips and dried beans to see them through to spring. The single pig they had raised had been claimed as tax by Lord Blackwood's steward, along with half their grain. What remained would need to stretch through months of scarcity. As the fire finally grew to a modest blaze, casting flickering shadows across the mud walls of their home, Eliza allowed herself a small moment of hope. They had survived winters before. They would find a way to endure this one too, with ingenuity, born of desperation and the fierce will to see another spring. But as another blast of wind found its way through the wall behind her, bringing with it a spray of ice that sizzled in the fire, she could not suppress the shiver of dread that ran through her body. This winter had only just begun, and it had already bared its teeth. Chapter 2. Thomas left before dawn, bundled in every layer of clothing the family could spare. Eliza watched him go with a mixture of pride and fear. He moved slowly, hampered by the knee that had never properly healed after an accident during last year's harvest. In summer, the pain was manageable. In winter, it transformed him into an old man before his 30th year. "Be careful," she called after him, though her words were swallowed by the howling wind. "Return before midday." With Thomas gone to seek trades in the village, Eliza turned her attention to their home. The previous night, S-storm had left new vulnerabilities in their defenses against the cold. A corner of the roof sagged alarmingly, where snow and ice had accumulated beyond the thatching's capacity to bear weight. The eastern wall, always their weakest point, now sported a crack through which she could actually see the white landscape. Outside, "Ned, fetch me the bucket of mud from the back corner," she instructed her eldest son, a boy of 8 years with his father's serious eyes and her own determined chin. Agnes, collect all the rags you can find. William, help your grandfather move closer to the fire. The children scrambled to obey, knowing the gravity of their situation even at their tender ages. Winter was not just a season, but an adversary, to be battled daily. Young William, named after the infant brother he had never known, guided his grandfather Edmund from his sleeping corner to the bench nearest the fire. The old man moved stiffly, his joints swollen and painful from years of labor in the Lord's fields. Should have reinforced the eastern wall with stones, Edmund muttered, lowering himself with a groan. Told your Thomas that before the first frost, too busy with the harvest he was. Eliza bit back a sharp retort. There had been no time between bringing in the meager harvest and preparing for winter. Every day had been filled with desperate activity, preserving what food they could, gathering firewood, repairing clothing, making candles from the precious tallow saved from last winter. The wall had been one task too many. We will fix it now, she said instead, taking the heavy bucket from Ned. The mixture inside mud, straw, and animal dung collected from the village common had partially frozen overnight. She placed it near enough to the fire to thaw without wasting precious heat. While waiting for the mud to soften, Eliza gathered the children around the fire. Today we must be clever as foxes, she told them, trying to make a game of their dire circumstances. We will hunt for every draft in our home and defeat it. Agnes giggled, her earlier fears forgotten in the light of day. I found one, she exclaimed, pointing to a gap between floor and wall where icy air visibly streamed in. Good eyes, little fox, Eliza praised. Ned, bring the moss bag. Throughout the autumn, they had collected sphagnum moss from the boggy areas beyond the village fields, dried and stored in sacks. It served as nature's own insulation. Ned brought the dwindling supply, and Eliza showed Agnes how to stuff it firmly into the gap. Press it in tight, she instructed. The wind is strong and will try to pull it out. As the children searched for drafts to seal, Eliza turned her attention to the cracked wall. The mud mixture had thawed enough to work with, though it chilled her hands to the bone as she scooped it out. She packed it firmly into the crack, reinforcing it with small stones and bits of broken pottery saved for this purpose. Over this first layer, she pressed a piece of woolen cloth, once part of a cloak, now too worn for wearing but perfect for holding the mud in place until it dried. In the old days, Edmund said, from his place by the fire, we would slaughter a goat and use its blood to strengthen the mud walls. Blood and mud together dried hard as stone. Eliza nodded but did not reply. They had no goat to slaughter, not anymore. The last one had been sold in autumn to pay the extra tax Lord Blackwood had imposed after poor harvests left his own coffers less full than desired. By mid-morning they had sealed the most egregious drafts, though Eliza knew their repairs were temporary at best. The eastern wall needed proper rebuilding, a task impossible until spring brought thawed ground and longer days for labor. For now, they could only patch and pray. "Mama, I am hungry," Agnes said, her small face pinched with a familiar expression that broke Eliza's heart daily. "We all are, sweet one," Eliza replied gently, "but we must wait for father to return. Perhaps he will bring something from the village." In truth, she doubted Thomas would return with food. What could he trade? The few eggs their remaining hens produced were precious commodities themselves. Perhaps he might secure a promise of help with the roof in exchange for Eliza's skilled weaving come spring. but immediate sustenance was unlikely. She stirred the pot of thin gruel that had been warming by the fire, their breakfast, and likely their supper as well. A single onion and a handful of dried peas, added to hot water, and the last scraping of fat from their empty bacon crock. She had been making it stretch for days, adding more water each time the level dropped to low. "Grandfather needs to eat now," William said, noticing how Edmund's hands trembled. The old man had grown increasingly frail since the first frost, his once strong body betraying him as food became scarcer. Eliza nodded, pouring a small portion into a wooden bowl. "Here, Father Edmund," she said, kneeling beside him. "Take what strength you can from this." The old man accepted the bowl with shaking hands. "Save it for the little ones," he protested weakly, though his eyes betrayed his hunger. "There is enough," Eliza lied smoothly. "Eat while it is warm." As Edmund slowly consumed the meager meal, Eliza divided what remained among the children, reserving nothing for herself. Her hunger was a constant companion now, a gnawing emptiness she had learned to ignore through sheer force of will. She would eat when Thomas returned, she told herself. Or perhaps tomorrow, when surely things would improve. A sudden commotion outside drew her attention. Voices called in alarm, followed by the sound of running feet crunching through snow. Eliza moved to the door, pulling aside the heavy cloth that served as both insulation and privacy. The sight that greeted her sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the bitter cold. Thomas was being carried between two village men, his face ashen, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. "He fell on the ice near the mill," explained Walter, the blacksmith's son. "The bone is broken clean through." Eliza's world narrowed to a single, terrible understanding. Without Thomas able to work, they would not survive this winter. Chapter 3. Lay him here, by the fire, Elisa directed, her voice remarkably steady despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her. The men carefully placed Thomas on the bench Edmund had vacated, the old man now standing with surprising strength, his own ailments forgotten in the face of this new crisis. Thomas's face was contorted with pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and when Eliza touched his hand, his skin felt clammy. I heard the bone snap, he gasped through clenched teeth, like a dry branch underfoot. Walter and the other man, a tenant farmer named John, shifted uncomfortably. "The path to the mill was pure ice," John explained. "He slipped where the hill steepens. There was nothing to grab onto." Eliza nodded, already pulling back the sodden layers of cloth from Thomas's leg. The break was visible even before. She fully exposed it, a sickening bulge midway between knee and ankle where the bone pressed against the skin from within. If it broke through, she swallowed hard. "Ned, fetch clean rags." "Agnes, bring water from the barrel, we need it warmed." "William, help your grandfather gather straight sticks from the firewood pile." Her calm directions belied the turmoil within. A broken leg in winter was often a death sentence. Without proper setting, it would heal crookedly if it healed at all. Infection was an ever-present danger, and even if Thomas survived, he might never walk properly again. "I will fetch Widow Thatcher," Walter offered. "She has knowledge of bone setting, and I will speak to Father Gregory," added John. "The church stores include medicinal herbs for such emergencies." Eliza nodded gratefully. "Thank you. We have little to offer in payment, but come spring," Walter waved away her words, "we are neighbors. Your Thomas would do the same for any of us." With that simple statement of village solidarity, the men departed, leaving Eliza to face the immediate crisis. "It hurts like hellfire," Thomas groaned, his usual stoicism crumbling under the onslaught of pain. "I know, my love," Eliza soothed, though in truth she could only imagine his suffering. "Widow Thatcher will come soon. Until then, we must keep the legs still." She worked quickly, tearing precious fabric into strips for binding. When William returned with an armful of sticks, she selected the straightest ones, laying them alongside Thomas's leg in preparation for the enormity of their situation pressed upon her like a physical weight. Thomas was their provider, their protector, the one whose strength they all relied upon. Now he lay helpless, and the responsibility for their survival fell squarely upon her shoulders. "The sheep pelts," Thomas said suddenly, his voice tight with pain. "I got them in my sack." Eliza glanced at the leather bag that had fallen by the door when the men carried Thomas in. "You still made the trade. After your fall." A ghost of Thomas's usual wry smile flickered across his face. "Walter helped me finish it. Traded my spring labor for them. Told Oswald I would help repair his barn when the thaw comes." The smile faded, replaced by a grimace of pain and worry. "If I can walk by then." "You will," Eliza said firmly, refusing to acknowledge the alternative. "You will heal strong as ever." Edmund, who had been watching silently, spoke up. "In my youth, I saw a man break his leg worse than this. Bone came right through. The skin, old Marjorie packed it with honey and moss, bound it straight, and by planting thyme, he walked with barely a limp." Eliza nodded, clinging to this thread of hope. "See, your father knows. You will heal." The door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and the diminutive figure of Widow Thatcher, wrapped in so many layers she appeared twice her actual size. Behind her came Father Gregory, the village priest, carrying a small bundle of herbs. "Let me see the damage," the widow said, without preamble, unwrapping her outer cloak and moving to Thomas's side. Her gnarled hands, experienced from decades of tending to village injuries, gently probed the break. Thomas hissed in pain, but did not cry out. "Clean break," she announced after a moment. "That is good as ear to set. But it must be done now, before swelling makes it impossible." She looked up at Eliza. "It will hurt him terribly." "I can bear it," Thomas said, though his face had gone even paler. Father Gregory stepped forward, offering a small leather pouch to Widow Thatcher. "Poppy seeds. Steep them quickly in hot water. It will dull the pain somewhat." While Agnes hurried to heat water over the fire, Widow Thatcher continued her examination. "He will need proper splints. These sticks are too short." She glanced at the rafters of the hut. "Do you have a broken tool handle? Something sturdy but not too heavy?" Edmund shuffled to the corner where their few tools were stored. "This will serve," he said, returning with a broken scythe handle. "Oak, strong enough to support a man's weight." The widow nodded approvingly. "Perfect. Now we need strong hands to pull while I set the bone." All eyes turned to Walter, who had returned with Father Gregory. The young blacksmith's apprentice had arms thick with muscle from his work at the forge. "I will do it," he said solemnly. Eliza turned to the children, who were watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Take your grandfather outside," she instructed. "Gather more firewood. We will need a hot fire all night to keep your father warm." "But Mama, it is so cold outside," Agnes protested. "Go with your brothers," Elisa said firmly. "This is not for children to see." Once the children and Edmund had reluctantly exited, bundled against the cold, Widow Thatcher gave brisk instructions. "Walter, you will pull the foot steady and strong. Father Gregory, hold his upper leg still. Eliza, give him this to bite down on. She handed Eliza a thick strip of leather, and you must hold his shoulders. He must not move when I set the bone. Thomas accepted the bitter poppy tea, drinking it quickly despite its unpleasant taste. Then he took the leather strap, placing it between his teeth. His eyes met Eliza's, filled with fear and determination. I love you, she whispered, positioning herself at his head, her hands firm on his shoulders. Be strong, my heart. What followed was a nightmare of pain and desperation. Despite the poppy tea, Thomas roared in agony when Walter pulled. On his foot, and Widow Thatcher manipulated the broken bone into alignment. His body bucked with such force that Eliza was nearly thrown off, but she held firm, whispering prayers and encouragements into his ear. The snap when the bone realigned was audible, a sickening sound that would haunt Eliza's dreams. Thomas fell limp immediately after, consciousness fleeing as his body surrendered to the overwhelming pain. Good widow, Thatcher said, already reaching for the splints. Better he sleeps through the binding. Hold the leg just so, father. We must. Keep it straight while I secure the splints. Working efficiently, she bound the broken leg between the oak splints, using strips of clean linen provided from the church stores. This must remain dry and untouched for at least 6 weeks, she instructed Eliza. Longer would be better. 6 weeks, Eliza echoed, her mind racing with calculations. 6 weeks of Thomas unable to work, unable to hunt or trade or repair their failing home. 6 weeks of winter's deepest grip, with food already scarce and firewood dwindling. He will need strengthening broths, the widow continued, seeming to read Eliza's thoughts. Meat when you can get it. The body needs substance to rebuild bone. Eliza nodded, though where such luxuries would come from, she had no idea. Their stores were already stretched beyond capacity. The village will help, Father Gregory said gently, placing a comforting hand on Elisa's shoulder. We do not let our own perish when misfortune strikes. Widow Thatcher nodded in agreement. Tomorrow I will bring comfrey to make a poultice. It helps knit bone, and willow bark for the pain he will need it when he wakes. As they prepared to leave, Eliza found herself fighting tears for the first time since Thomas had been carried in. The kindness of her neighbors threatened to break the rigid control she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Thank you, she managed to say. We are in your debt. Father Gregory shook his head. We are all God's children, especially. In hardship, remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. We are commanded to care for one another. After they had gone, Eliza allowed the children and Edmund back inside. They clustered around Thomas, who remained unconscious, his face slack, but no longer contorted with pain. Will father die? William asked, his young voice trembling. No, Eliza said firmly, with more conviction than she felt. He is strong. He will heal. But as she tucked the children into their bed that night, instructing them to sleep close to share warmth, Eliza's mind raced with fear. Outside, the wind had risen again, bringing fresh snow that piled against their door. The roof creaked ominously under its growing burden. Without Thomas able to clear it or reinforce the sagging section, how long before it collapsed? She sat beside her sleeping husband, bathing his forehead with cool water to combat the fever that had begun to rise. In the flickering firelight, his face appeared gaunt already, though it had been less than a day since his accident. You must live, she whispered to him. We cannot survive this winter without you. But even as she spoke the words, a steely determination was forming. Within her, they would survive. Somehow, she would find a way. For Thomas, for the children, for the unborn child she suspected was growing within her, but had not yet found the courage to mention. She would fight with every ounce of strength and cunning she possessed. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, a lone predator seeking prey in the frozen landscape. Eliza straightened her back, her jaw set in defiance. Let winter bring its worst. She would not surrender without a battle. Chapter 4. Thomas's fever broke on the third night, a small mercy that Eliza accepted with quiet gratitude. He awoke, disoriented but lucid, his first words a question about the children. They are well, Eliza assured him, helping him sip from a cup of watered cider. Walter brought us a brace of rabbits yesterday. The children have meat in their bellies for the first time in weeks. Thomas relaxed slightly at this news, though his eyes remained troubled. The roof, he said, glancing upward at the sagging. Thatching, it will not hold much longer. I know, Eliza replied simply. There was no point denying what they both could see. During the 3 days of Thomas's fever, another storm had deposited a fresh layer of snow across the countryside. The weight on their roof had increased alarmingly, causing the central beam to bow in a way that sent fear through Eliza every time she looked at it. You must get help, Thomas insisted, trying to sit up before falling back with a groan as pain shot through his splintered leg. Lie still, Eliza commanded. Walter has promised to come tomorrow with 2 other men. They will clear the snow and shore up the beam with a post. She did not mention the cost of this assistance. Her promise to weave new shirts for all 3 men come spring. A substantial commitment of time and skill that would have to be fulfilled regardless of their own needs. Thomas nodded, closing his eyes briefly against another wave of pain and food. How are our stores holding? Eliza hesitated. The truth was too harsh to burden him with while he lay helpless. Their food supplies, meager to begin with, were dwindling rapidly. The rabbit meat had been a blessing, but it would not last. The grain been held barely enough for another week of the thin gruel that had become their primary sustenance. We have enough, she said at last. Father Gregory brought a small sack of dried peas from the church stores yesterday, and Edmund has set snares in the forest edge. The forest edge, that is poaching, Thomas said sharply, fear evident in his voice. If he is caught, he will not be caught, Eliza interrupted. The Lord's gamekeeper rarely patrols the eastern boundary in this weather, and we need the meat, Thomas. The children grow weaker by the day. Thomas subsided, knowing she was right, but hating the necessity that drove his family to risk. Harsh penalties for the sake of a few morsels of meat. Poaching from the Lord's forest was punishable by imprisonment, or worse, the loss of a hand for a first offense, death for a repeat offender. Where are they now? He asked, changing the subject. Edmund took the boys to check the snares. Agnes is with Widow Collins, helping to card wool in exchange for a pot of broth. Eliza adjusted the rough blanket covering Thomas, careful not to disturb his splintered leg. Everyone in the village contributes what they can. Your accident has reminded people of how fragile our lives are, how quickly fortune can turn. Thomas's expression softened. You have managed well, he said, reaching for her hand. I feared. When I fell, I thought, this is how my family dies. Without me to provide, how would you survive until spring? We survive together, Eliza said firmly, or not at all. The village knows this truth. No family stands alone against winter. As if summoned by her words, a knock came at the door. Eliza rose to answer it, admitting a blast of cold air, along with Father Gregory. The priest stamped snow from his boots before entering fully, his arms laden with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "How fares our patient today?" he asked cheerfully, moving to Thomas's side. "Better, Father," Thomas replied. "The fever has broken, God be praised," the priest said, making the sign of the cross. "I have brought something that may help your recovery." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small earthenware pot sealed with wax. "Bone broth from the Christmas calf. The richness will help mend your leg." Eliza accepted the pot with genuine gratitude. The church had slaughtered a calf for the Christmas feast, a rare abundance of meat that had been stretched to feed as many villagers as possible. That Father Gregory had reserved some of the precious broth specifically for Thomas spoke volumes about the priest. As concern for their family, "You are too generous, Father," she said, already moving to hang the pot near the fire to warm its contents. "Not at all," he replied, waving away her thanks. "I have also spoken with Lord Blackwood's steward regarding your situation." Both Eliza and Thomas stiffened at this news. The Lord's steward, Master Simeon, was known for his harsh enforcement of the Lord's rights and privileges. Requests for leniency or assistance were typically met with cold refusal. "The steward has agreed," Father Gregory continued, "to reduce your winter tax by half, in recognition of Thomas's injury and service to the manor." "Half," Thomas repeated incredulously. "But that... that would mean—" "You may keep the remaining sack of grain that would have been collected next week," the priest confirmed, unable to suppress a small smile of satisfaction. "I reminded Master Simeon that your family has never failed to meet its obligations, even in lean years, and that such loyalty deserves recognition." Eliza sank onto a stool, momentarily overwhelmed by this unexpected reprieve. One sack of grain could mean the difference between starvation and survival until the first spring. Greens appeared. "How did you convince him?" Thomas asked, knowing the steward's reputation for inflexibility. Father Gregory's smile turned slightly mischievous. "I may have mentioned that Lord Blackwood's own mother once received similar consideration when his father was injured in a hunting accident, and that the Lord's Christian charity would surely be noted when he stands before St. Peter at the gates of heaven." Thomas chuckled, despite his pain, then winced at the movement. "Well played, Father. The Lord works in mysterious ways," the priest replied with exaggerated innocence. "Now I must continue my rounds. Other families struggle as well. In this bitter season," he moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Eliza Widow Thatcher asked me to tell you she has set aside some dried comfrey for another poultice. You should collect it when you can." After Father Gregory departed, a moment of stunned silence filled the humble dwelling. Thomas finally broke it, his voice thick with emotion. "We might survive, after all." "We will survive," Eliza corrected him, the determination in her voice stronger than ever. "This is but the first sign of God's providence." The door opened again, admitting Edmund and the boys. Their faces were reddened from cold, but their expressions held an excitement that Eliza had not seen in weeks. "We caught to hares," Ned announced triumphantly, holding up the limp forms of their prize. "Grandfather showed us how to reset the snares after checking them." Edmund nodded, his roomy eyes bright with satisfaction. "Good-sized ones, too. Fat for the season. They will make a fine stew." William bounced on his toes, unable to contain his enthusiasm. "And we saw deer. Tracks. Many of them, heading toward the stream where the ice is thinner. Grandfather says when the snow stops, we might set a larger trap." Eliza exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, whose expression reflected her own mixture of hope and fear. Snaring. Small game from the forest edge might be overlooked. Actively hunting deer was a far more serious offense. Yet the meat from a single deer could sustain them for weeks. One challenge at a time, she said diplomatically. For now, these hares are blessing enough. Ned, fetch my skinning knife. William, bring water to clean them. As the boys hurried to obey, Edmund moved to Thomas's side, laying a gnarled hand on his son's shoulder. The leg looks better, he observed. Less swollen than yesterday. It feels somewhat better, Thomas admitted. Though it pains me still when I try to move. Keep it still, Edmund advised. I have seen men lamed for life by trying to walk too soon on a broken bone. He lowered his voice, glancing toward Eliza, who was now instructing the boys in the proper way to prepare the hares for cooking. She is stronger than either of us knew. Thomas followed his father's gaze, watching as Eliza efficiently directed the children's efforts, her movements purposeful and assured despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. She has always been strong, he said softly. I just never gave her cause to show it fully. Edmund nodded sagely. The harshest winters revealed the truest character. Your mother was the same fierce as a wolf when her cubs were threatened. He squeezed Thomas's shoulder. You chose well in her. Eliza worked quickly, transforming the hares into a pot of stew enriched with the bone broth Father Gregory had brought. The aroma that soon filled their humble home was the richest they had experienced in months, causing all their stomachs to growl in anticipation. That night, they ate better than they had since harvest time. Even Agnes returned with not only the promised pot of broth from Widow Collins, but also a small bundle of wool scraps payment for her diligent work. She said, I have clever fingers, the little girl announced proudly. She will teach me to spin properly when the weather warms. As darkness fell, the family huddled close to the fire, their bellies satisfied for the first time in weeks. Outside, the wind still howled, and the cold remained a constant threat, but within their fragile shelter, a cautious optimism had taken root. Tell us a story, Mama Agnes requested, her small body nestled against Eliza's side. Chapter 5. Eliza stroked Agnes's hair, searching her tired mind for a tale that might bring comfort rather than remind them of their precarious situation. Once, long ago, she began, there lived a family in a beautiful valley where summer lasted, all year round. As Eliza spun her tale of an imaginary land without winter's bite, the wind outside intensified, rattling the door and whistling through the remaining cracks in their walls. Despite the warm meal in their bellies, the cold seemed determined to remind them of its constant presence. When her story concluded, Eliza tucked the children into their shared bed, piling every available blanket and piece of clothing atop them for warmth. Sleep close together, she reminded them, as she did every night. Share your warmth like cubs in a den. With the children settled, she returned to Thomas's side. He had listened to her story with a small smile playing on his lips, though pain still etched lines around his eyes. You should rest as well, he told her. You have barely slept since my accident. Soon, she promised, though they both knew sleep would be elusive. The roof concerned her greatly during her story. A fresh shower of debris had fallen from the ceiling when a particularly strong gust shook their dwelling. If it collapsed during the night, Edmund, who had been dozing by the fire, roused himself with a hacking cough. The wind shifts, he announced, his weather sense honed by decades of farming. Comes now from the north. Colder air approaches. Eliza nodded grimly. Northern winds brought the most bitter cold, the kind that could freeze a person in there. Sleep if the fire died. We must take turns tending the fire tonight, she decided. I will watch until midnight, then wake you, Father Edmund. The old man nodded, though Thomas protested. My father needs his rest as much as you do. Wake me instead. You need healing sleep, Eliza countered firmly. The more you rest, the sooner your leg will mend. Besides, you cannot easily move to tend the fire. Thomas subsided, knowing she was right but hating his helplessness. Tomorrow I will. Sit up properly, he insisted. Perhaps fashion a crutch so I can move about somewhat. We shall see, Eliza replied noncommittally, unwilling to encourage any activity that might jeopardize his healing. After Edmund and Thomas had drifted into uneasy sleep, Eliza sat alone by the fire, methodically feeding it small pieces. Of their dwindling wood supply, the flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, creating illusions of movement that occasionally startled her. Outside, the wind's howl had taken on a deeper, more ominous tone. Edmund was right. The air was changing, growing sharper with a cold that seemed to slice through their walls like an invisible blade. Eliza pulled Thomas's cloak tighter around her shoulders, grateful for its weight and the remnants of his scent that clung to the rough wall. So much depended on his recovery. Without his strong arms to work the fields come spring, how would they plant crops? How would they rebuild their home, which surely would not survive another winter in its current state? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft whimper from Agnes. The child was dreaming, her small face contorted with some imagined fear. Eliza moved quietly to her side, gently stroking her forehead until the troubled expression eased. All three children were thinner than they should be, their growing bodies demanding more sustenance than she could provide, even with today's unexpected bounty. The stark reality of their situation remained unchanged. They balanced on a knife's edge between survival and disaster. A sudden, sharp crack from above snapped her attention to the ceiling. One of the supporting poles had developed a new split, visible even in the dim firelight. Eliza's heart raced as she calculated how quickly it might fail completely. Should she wake everyone? Move them away from that section of the roof, but to where? Their single room offered no safer corner. A sound outside distracted her from these fearful thoughts, the distinct crunch of footsteps in snow approaching their door. No neighbor would visit at this hour, in this weather. Fear clutched at her throat. Thieves, outlaws. In desperate times, even villages like theirs were not immune to those who would take by force what they could not earn by honest means. Eliza reached for Thomas's wood-cutting axe, which leaned against the wall near the door. It felt awkward and heavy in her hands, but she gripped it firmly, prepared to defend her family if necessary. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then, instead of a forceful entry, came a soft knock. Eliza hesitated, confused. Thieves would not knock. Who calls at this hour? She demanded, keeping her voice low to avoid waking the children, but investing it with all the strength she could muster. It is Walter, came the muffled reply. And John, we bring help. Relief flooded through Eliza. She set down the axe and unbarred the door, opening it just enough to confirm their identities before allowing them inside. Both men were heavily bundled against the cold, their beards rimed with ice, their shoulders dusted with fresh snow. The storm worsens, Walter explained without preamble. John saw the state of your roof yesterday and feared it might not last the night. We have come to brace it properly. Eliza stared at them in disbelief. Now, in darkness, in this cold. John nodded, already unwrapping the coverings from a bundle of tools he carried. Better to work now than to dig you out from under a collapsed roof tomorrow. The northern winds bring snow thick as wool by dawn. The weight could double. Thomas had awakened at the sound of voices. Walter, John, what madness brings you here in the dead of night? Walter moved to his friend's side, clasping his hand briefly. The same madness that would bring you to our homes if our families were threatened, he replied simply. Now, where is your best rope? We must secure the beams before we can work on them. Stunned by this unexpected salvation, Eliza directed them to the family's few possessions. Within minutes, the men had assessed the damage and begun their repairs, working quietly but efficiently to minimize disturbance to the sleeping children. They had brought a sturdy oak post, salvaged from John S. barn, which they positioned under the most precarious section of the ceiling beam. This will hold, Walter assured her as they worked, at least until the weather breaks enough for proper repairs. Why do you do this? Elisa asked, holding their rushlights to illuminate their work. You risk your own safety, traveling in such conditions. John glanced at her, surprise evident in his weathered face. We are neighbors, he said, as if this explained everything, and perhaps it did. In their harsh world, no family could truly stand alone. Today her family needed help. Tomorrow it might be John S. or Walter S., the unspoken covenant of village. Life was their only true security against winter S. cruelty. Their work continued for over an hour. The men speaking little but communicating through gestures and shared understanding born of previous collaborations. When they finally declared themselves satisfied, the roof looked far from perfect but undeniably more stable. The central beam no longer bowed so alarmingly, and the posts they had installed stood firm against the downward pressure. It will hold now, Walter confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. But come the first thaw, a proper rebuilding will be needed. That beam has rotted through in places. We will help then too, John added. Many hands make quicker work. Eliza wanted to thank them properly, to offer some token of the gratitude that overwhelmed her, but they waved away her stumbling words. Keep your family warm, Walter said simply. That is thanks enough. After they departed, disappearing into the swirling snow like phantoms, Eliza sank onto the bench beside Thomas, emotion finally overtaking her rigid self-control. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she leaned against him, careful not to disturb his injured leg. We are blessed in our neighbors, Thomas murmured, his arm around her shoulders. I feared the roof would fall tonight, she confessed. I was planning where to shelter the children if it did, and now it will hold, he assured her. We will survive this winter, Eliza. Together, for the first time since Thomas S. accident, Eliza allowed herself to truly believe his words. The path ahead remained treacherous food scarcity, bitter cold, and Thomas S. uncertain recovery all threatened their survival, but they were not facing these challenges alone. The village stood with them, a bulwark against winter's worst assaults. Outside, the northern wind continued its relentless howling, but within their strengthened home, hope had taken root alongside fear. Eliza finally succumbed to her exhaustion, falling into the first deep sleep she had experienced in days, her head resting against Thomas's shoulder, his steady heartbeat a reassuring rhythm beneath her ear. Chapter 6. The following week brought weather so severe that venturing outdoors became an act of desperation rather than choice. Snow fell continuously for 3 days, accumulating in drifts taller than a man. When it finally ceased, a stillness descended that was almost more unsettling than the howling winds had been. The profound silence of a world muffled beneath an enormous white blanket. Temperatures plummeted to depths the oldest villagers claimed were unprecedented in living memory. Widow Thatcher, during a brief visit to check on Thomas's leg, reported that 3 elderly residents of outlying cottages had been found frozen in their beds, their fires extinguished by the treacherous draughts that no amount of patching could fully eliminate. "You are fortunate," she told Eliza as she examined Thomas's splintered limb. "Your home stands close to others, sheltered somewhat from the direct assault of the wind, and your fire burns well." Eliza nodded, though fortunate seemed a curious description of their circumstances. True, they were alive, no small achievement, given the brutality of the season, but their situation remained precarious. The grain sack saved from taxation was diminishing rapidly. Edmund S. snares, which had produced such bounty before the heaviest snows, now sat buried and inaccessible. The hares had long since been consumed, their bones boiled repeatedly for soup until even that meager sustenance was exhausted. How much longer will this cold last? She asked the widow, who was reputed to have an almost uncanny ability to predict weather patterns. The old woman shrugged, her bony shoulders rising beneath her multiple layers of clothing. "The moon wanes," she observed cryptically. 3 nights past full. Often the breaking comes with the new moon. 9 more days, Eliza calculated. Silently, 9 days of keeping the fire burning, of stretching their dwindling food supplies, of watching her children grow paler and quieter with each passing day. "Your husband heals well," Widow Thatcher continued, rewrapping Thomas's leg after applying a fresh poultice of comfrey and other herbs that gave off a pungent, earthy scent. "The bone knits clean. He is strong." "When might he put weight upon it?" Thomas asked, hope evident in his voice. His forced inactivity clearly weighed on him as heavily as his concern for their survival. "Not for another month at least," the widow replied firmly, and then only with a sturdy crutch. "Rush it, and you risk the bone breaking anew. Or worse, healing crooked so you limp forever." Thomas's face fell, but he nodded acceptance of her verdict. "A month. If we have a month." The widow's sharp eyes missed nothing. "You fear your supplies will not last," she stated rather than asked. "We manage," Eliza replied automatically, the response she gave to all inquiries about their welfare. Pride prevented a more honest assessment, though she suspected Widow Thatcher was not deceived. Indeed, the old woman snorted softly at this transparent evasion. "Pride makes poor eating," she remarked. "Listen, child, when I leave here, I go to check on the miller's wife, who labors with her first child. A difficult birth by all signs. I have prepared a strengthening broth for her, more than she will need. The remainder shall be left with you." "We cannot take food meant for a birthing mother," Eliza protested, though her stomach cramped sharply at the mere mention of broth. "You can and will," the widow countered, her tone brooking no argument. "The miller's stores are plentiful. They slaughtered a pig before the worst snows came. This broth is made from those bones, with parsnips and onions from their root. Selah, they will not miss what I leave with you." Before Eliza could object further, a commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Voices called back and forth, footsteps crunched through the crusted snow, and then a sharp knock rattled. Their door. Edmund, who had been teaching the children a game involving pebbles and a crudely drawn board to distract them from their hunger, rose stiffly to answer. When he opened the door, a blast of frigid air preceded the entrance of Father Gregory. Accompanied by two young men Eliza recognized as brothers who worked the church lands in exchange for lodging. "Good day to you all," the priest greeted them, his typical cheer somewhat subdued by obvious exhaustion. His face was drawn, with dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting several sleepless nights. "I come with news and an unusual request." "What news, Father?" Thomas asked, pushing himself up on his elbows for a better view of their visitors. "The church roof has partially collapsed under the weight of the snow," Father Gregory replied gravely. "The eastern transept is now open to the elements. The altar remains protected, thanks be to God, but the damage is extensive." Gasps of dismay met this announcement. The church was not merely a place of worship, but the community's strongest structure, a sanctuary in both spiritual and physical senses. During previous harsh winters, it had sheltered those whose homes proved insufficient against the elements. "This is grave news indeed," Edmund said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Where will the displaced families shelter now?" "That is related to my request," Father Gregory continued. "We must clear the snow and make temporary repairs before the next storm arrives. Every able-bodied person in the village is being asked to assist. But while the men work on the repairs, the women and children need shelter. Your home stands closest to the church, and I hoped you wish us to host those displaced by the collapse," Eliza finished for him, already calculating the implications. Their small dwelling barely accommodated their own family. How could they possibly fit others? "Just the women and smallest children," the priest clarified quickly. "Perhaps 5 or 6 in total. The work should take only a day, 2 at most." Eliza exchanged glances with Thomas, whose expression reflected her own conflicted feelings. Their home was hardly suitable for guests, cold, cramped, with food stores that barely sustained their own family. Yet to refuse assistance to neighbors in need went against every principle of village solidarity, the same unspoken covenant that had brought Walter and John to repair their roof in the dead of night. "Of course they may come," Thomas said before Eliza could formulate a response. "We have little space and less comfort to offer, but what we have, we share gladly." Father Gregory's face relaxed in evident relief. "Your generosity will be remembered," he assured them. "I have taken the liberty of arranging for additional firewood to be delivered shortly, and the church stores will provide food for all during this arrangement." At the mention of food, Eliza saw her children's heads lift, sudden interest animating their previously listless expressions. Even Edmund straightened slightly, though he tried to disguise his reaction with a cough. "When will they arrive?" Eliza asked, already mentally rearranging their sparse furniture to create maximum floor space. "Within the hour," the priest replied. "I must continue my rounds to organize the repair efforts, but these good lads will bring the firewood directly." He nodded toward the 2 young men who had accompanied him, both now shuffling awkwardly near the door, clearly eager to complete their task and escape the cold. After Father Gregory departed, Eliza turned to Edmund and the children. "We must prepare," she announced with brisk efficiency that belied her fatigue. "Ned, William, help your grandfather move his sleeping pallet to the far corner. Agnes, gather any stray items and place them in the storage chest. I will sweep the floor and prepare more water for our guests." Despite the enormity of the challenge before them, Eliza felt a curious lightening of her spirits as they worked. The prospect of company after days of isolation brought a welcome change to their routine. More significantly, the promise of additional food and fuel eased her most pressing concerns, if only temporarily. True to Father Gregory's word, the young men returned within half an hour, staggering under the weight of split logs that they stacked neatly by the door. The quantity was generous enough to maintain a strong fire for several days, even with extra bodies to warm. Barely had they departed when the first of their guests arrived. Widow Collins, supporting a heavily pregnant young woman, Eliza, recognized as Alice, wife to the cooper's apprentice. Behind them came Mary, the blacksmith's wife, carrying her infant son wrapped in so many layers only his tiny red face was visible. 2 more women followed, each bringing small bundles of personal belongings and expressions that mingled relief at finding shelter with embarrassment at imposing on an already crowded household. "Bless you for taking us in," Widow Collins said, as Eliza helped her over the threshold. The church grew so cold after the collapse that little Thomas here began turning blue. She nodded toward the infant, who was whimpering softly against his mother's chest. "You are welcome to what comfort we can provide," Eliza replied, directing the women to positions around the fire. "Please, warm yourselves. There is water heating for tea." Alice, the pregnant woman, sank gratefully onto the bench Edmund had vacated for her use. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. "My time is near," she confided to Eliza in a whisper. "I had hoped for better circumstances for my first birthing." Eliza squeezed the younger woman's shoulder reassuringly. "Widow Thatcher says the cold often slows the birthing process. Perhaps your babe will wait for warmer days." She did not voice her concern about a newborn's chances of survival. In such bitter conditions, infant mortality was high even in favorable seasons. Winter births were particularly perilous. "The men say they will have at least the transept covered by nightfall," Mary reported, unwrapping some of her son's layers now that they were in the relative warmth of the hut. Walter brought timbers from the old mill to create a temporary framework. Mention of Walter brought a small smile to Thomas's face. "That man works harder than any 2 others combined," he remarked from his pallet. "If anyone can make the church habitable again quickly, it is Walter." As predicted, their small dwelling was soon crowded to capacity. The arrival of Widow Thatcher with the promised broth added a 9th person to their number. The old woman took one look at the crowded conditions and nodded approvingly. "Good," she declared. "Body heat is better than any fire for true warmth. You will all sleep soundly tonight." The broth she had brought proved substantial indeed, rich liquid, dense with bits of meat, root vegetables, and barley. Shared among all present, it provided a small but satisfying portion for each person. For Eliza's children, who had subsisted on watery gruel for days, the hearty soup was a feast beyond imagining. Even little Agnes, who had grown increasingly disinterested in food as their supplies dwindled, consumed her portion with evident enjoyment. As darkness fell, the temperature outside plummeted further. Inside, however, the combined warmth of 9 bodies and a well-fed fire created an almost uncomfortably heated atmosphere. For the first time in weeks, Eliza found herself loosening her shawl rather than clutching it tighter. The women arranged themselves and the children on the floor around the central hearth, using their cloaks and the few spare blankets Eliza could provide to create makeshift bedding. Thomas remained on his pallet near the wall, with Edmund beside him. Despite the crowded conditions, a surprising sense of camaraderie developed as they shared stories and news from different parts of the village. "The baker says his stores of flour will last until March if strictly rationed," Mary reported. "And the mill wheel is frozen solid, nothing to grind until the thaw comes anyway." My Henry claims he saw deer tracks near the village pond. Another woman added, says they grow desperate enough to venture closer to people than he has ever seen. The river has frozen so thick that Master Fletcher S. boys walked across it yesterday, Widow Collins contributed, all the way to the far bank and back without a single crack in the ice. These snippets of information, trivial in normal times, held vital significance during their enforced isolation. Each report helped construct a broader picture of their community's condition, providing context for their own struggles and small reassurance that they were not suffering alone. As the evening progressed, an unexpected harmony emerged from their improvised arrangement. The children, energized by better food and novel company, played together quietly. The women, finding common purpose in their shared predicament, exchanged practical advice about conserving heat and stretching meager supplies. When Widow Thatcher began humming an old folk melody, others gradually joined in, their voices blending in a soft chorus that seemed to hold winter at bay more effectively than any physical barrier. Even Thomas, despite his pain, added his deep baritone to the impromptu music. That night, Eliza slept more soundly than she had in weeks, wedged between Agnes and Alice, with the steady rhythm of breathing bodies all around her, creating a cocoon of shared humanity against the implacable cold beyond their walls. Her last conscious thought before drifting into sleep was a prayer of gratitude for this unexpected respite, moment of community and relative abundance in the heart of winter's darkest days. Chapter 7. Morning brought muted light through the small window openings and the discovery that their unexpected communal arrangement would extend longer than anticipated. John arrived shortly after dawn with news that, while work on the church roof had progressed well, a new challenge had emerged. The temporary supports are in place, he explained, warming his hands by Eliza's fire. But the timbers Walter brought proved insufficient for proper coverage. He and Michael have gone to the abandoned cottage beyond the mill to salvage what beams they can. The old forester's hut, Edmund asked, his roomy eyes widening in surprise, that lies nearly a league distant and through the deepest drifts. John nodded grimly. No closer source could be found. They took the miller's sledge and his strongest ox, but the going will be slow. They cannot return before tomorrow at earliest. This announcement was met with mixed reactions from the assembled women. Some sighed in resignation, others exchanged concerned glances. For families already stretched beyond capacity by winter, as deprivations, each additional day of disruption compounded their difficulties. Then we shall remain together another night, Widow Collins declared practically. Better crowded and warm than scattered and freezing. Eliza nodded agreement, though her thoughts turned immediately to practical concerns. Another day meant another meal to provide for 9 people instead of 5. While Father Gregory had promised food from the church stores, no delivery had yet materialized. Their own supplies, even with careful rationing, would not stretch to feed so many. "John," she said quietly, drawing him aside from the others, "what of the provisions Father Gregory mentioned? Our stores are meager at best." John looked uncomfortable. The church pantry was damaged in the collapse. Most of the winter, stores were moved to the miller's storehouse for safekeeping, but in the confusion, he trailed off, his expression apologetic. "I will speak with Father Gregory immediately. Surely something can be arranged." After he departed, Eliza assessed their situation with clear-eyed pragmatism. Their woodpile, though recently replenished, would not last indefinitely with the fire burning continuously. Water was plentiful. Enough, thanks to melted snow, but food remained the critical concern. The communal pot of gruel she had prepared at dawn, already thinner than she would have preferred, had been quickly consumed, leaving nothing for the midday meal. While the other women attended to various tasks, Mary nursing her infant, Alice resting her swollen belly, Widow Collins teaching the children a string game to keep them occupied, Eliza beckoned Edmund to follow her to the far corner of the hut. "We must find more food," she whispered, keeping her voice below the general murmur of conversation. "The children grow weaker each day, and now we have more mouths to feed." Edmund nodded, his weathered face solemn. "The snares remain our best hope, though reaching them will be difficult in these drifts." "Can you manage it?" Eliza asked, studying his frail form doubtfully. The old man had grown noticeably thinner since winter's onset, his once sturdy frame now nearly as delicate as the children's. "Not alone," Edmund admitted, "but perhaps with Ned's help. The boy is small enough to move through the lower branches where the snow is less deep, and his eyes are sharper than mine for spotting game trails." Eliza hesitated, torn between necessity and maternal protection. Ned was only 8, sending him into the forest edge during such bitter cold carried significant risks. Yet the alternative, slow starvation for all of them, was arguably worse. "I will go with them," came a soft voice behind her. Eliza turned to find Widow Thatcher standing nearby, her sharp ears having apparently caught their whispered conversation. "I must gather more herbs for Thomas S. Poultice in any case. 3 sets of eyes will be better than 2. Relieved by this unexpected support, Eliza made her decision. "Very well, but you must return before midday, regardless of success. The temperature drops quickly after noon, and I will not risk any of you being caught in the forest then." The expedition departed shortly thereafter, Ned nearly bouncing with excitement at this adventure, Edmund moving stiffly but purposefully, and Widow Thatcher bringing up the rear with a covered basket ostensibly for herb collection. Eliza watched them go with a knot of anxiety in her stomach, silently praying for both their safety and success. With the hunting party gone, Eliza turned her attention to extracting maximum value from what little remained in their stores. A handful of dried peas, some withered turnips saved from autumn, a small portion of precious salt, these would have to create a meal for 9 people. She set water to boil over the fire, then began the painstaking process of peeling and chopping the ancient vegetables, salvaging every edible morsel. "Can I help?" Alice asked, wadding to Elisa's side with one hand supporting her lower back. "I weave well, if you have mending to be done while we cook." Eliza gratefully accepted the offer, directing the younger woman to a pile of garments. In desperate need of repper socks worn through at heel and toe, a tunic with a torn sleeve, Thomas S. work shirt fraying at the collar and cuffs. As Alice settled herself with needle and thread, other women gradually joined their impromptu work circle. Mary, having finished nursing her infant, offered to take over the food preparation. Widow Collins produced a small bundle of clean rags. From her personal belongings, perfect for patching children's garments, what began as a practical necessity slowly transformed into an almost festive atmosphere of feminine cooperation. Hands that had been idle too long found purpose in shared work. Tongues loosened as they exchanged village gossip, childering advice, and the kind of intimate knowledge that passed between women across generations. "My grandmother swore by onion poultices for chest colds," Mary was saying as she carefully stirred the thin soup. "Said they drew out the ill humours better than any herb." "Onions and honey together work wonders," Widow Collins agreed, "though honey is rare as gold these days." "My mother used bear fat on winter coughs," Alice contributed, her needle flashing steadily through the sock she was darning. "But I have not seen a bear hunted in these woods since I was a child." Thomas, who had been listening silently, from his palate, cleared his throat. "My father once encountered a bear near the high ridge," he said, drawing all eyes to him. "Do you remember, father?" Edmund had not yet returned, of course, but Thomas's question opened a door to storytelling that soon engaged everyone present. Tales of remarkable hunts, legendary storms, village celebrations from more prosperous years. Narrative transported them temporarily beyond their current hardships. Eliza found herself relaxing into this unexpected community, her constant anxiety briefly soothed by the simple pleasure of women working together while sharing tales. This, she realized, was how their ancestors had survived countless winters before them, not through individual heroism, but through the accumulated strength of communal bonds. Knowledge passed down and burdens shared when the hunting party finally returned just before noon. Their success proved modest but welcome to skinny rabbits and a wood pigeon, supplemented by various roots and bark Widow Thatcher had collected for both medicinal and culinary purposes. The old woman immediately set to preparing these additions for the communal pot, showing Eliza how certain tree barks could be scraped and boiled to provide both thickening for the soup and vital nutrients their bodies craved. "Pine bark contains life-giving properties," she explained, demonstrating how to remove the tough outer layer to reach the softer inner portion. "The forest offers sustenance even in deepest winter, if one knows where to look." By late afternoon, delicious aromas filled the small dwelling, drawing everyone's attention to the bubbling pot. The meal, when finally distributed, provided only a small portion for each person, but its rich flavor and varied textures offered satisfaction beyond mere caloric value. The children ate with enthusiasm, color returning to their pale cheeks, as the nourishing broth warmed them from within. As darkness approached, another visitor arrived, Father Gregory, his cassock dusted with snow, his expression both weary and determined. With him came welcome supplies, a small sack of oats, several dried apples, and a precious wedge of hard cheese, carefully wrapped in cloth. "The miller's wife insisted, you must have these," he explained, handing the provisions to Eliza. "She says no household should bear the burden of unexpected guests without community support." "Please convey our deepest gratitude," Eliza replied, nearly overwhelmed by this generosity. The cheese alone represented a luxury they had not experienced in months. "The repairs progress well," Father Gregory continued, accepting the cup of hot water flavored with pine needles that Widow Collins pressed into his hands. "Walter and Michael returned earlier than expected with sufficient timber. If weather permits, the church should be habitable again by tomorrow evening." This news brought visible relief to the gathered women, though Eliza noted with some surprise that she felt a twinge of regret as well. Their crowded coexistence, initially awkward, had evolved into something unexpectedly nurturing. The shared work, communal meals, and exchange of knowledge had created a feminine fellowship that would be difficult to replicate once they dispersed to their separate dwellings. That evening, as they prepared for their second night of communal sleeping, a strange contentment pervaded their humble shelter. Outside, winter maintained its merciless grip on the landscape. Inside, human connection had temporarily transformed. Their experience of hardship from individual suffering to shared challenge. Eliza, settling between Agnes and Alice once more, found herself reflecting on winter's paradoxical nature, how the season that threatened their survival most acutely also forged their strongest bonds. Perhaps this was winter's hidden gift, the stripping away of self-sufficiency as illusion, revealing the fundamental truth that humans were never meant to endure alone. "Eliza," Alice whispered as the others drifted towards sleep. "Thank you for sheltering us. I have learned more about preparing for my babe's arrival from today's conversations than in all the months previous. We have all benefited from this arrangement," Eliza whispered back truthfully. "Rest now. Your child needs your strength." As sleep claimed her, Eliza's last conscious thought was that perhaps they were not merely surviving this winter after all. In some essential, indefinable way, they were living it, fully experiencing depths of connection and community that more comfortable times rarely demanded or allowed. Chapter 8. The promised repairs to the church roof were completed by the following evening, allowing their guests to return to the relative spaciousness of the village sanctuary. Eliza watched them depart with mixed emotions: relief at reclaiming their small home for just their family again, yet a curious sense of loss as the vibrant feminine energy that had temporarily transformed their dwelling dissipated. "You seem melancholy," Thomas observed from his pallet as Eliza straightened their meager belongings after the women's departure. "Do you miss the company already?" "Perhaps," she admitted, pausing in her work. There was something strengthening about sharing our hardships so directly, as if the weight became lighter when distributed among more shoulders. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That is the essence of village life, is it not? No single family could survive alone in this harsh land. We need one another, perhaps more than we care to acknowledge in easier times." The conversation was interrupted by Ned and William, who burst through the door in a flurry of excitement, their cheeks reddened from cold but their eyes bright with news. "Father, grandfather, the ice fishermen have returned," Ned announced breathlessly. 3 men from the far shore crossed the frozen river with sleds full of fish. William nodded vigorously in confirmation. "Huge fish, bigger than my arm, and they trade them for grain and cloth." Thomas straightened, wincing slightly as the movement disturbed his healing leg. "This is welcome news indeed. Fresh fish in midwinter would strengthen us all." He looked to Eliza, the unspoken question evident in his expression. What did they have to trade? Eliza mentally inventoried their possessions, finding little of value that they could spare. The grain sack saved from taxation remained there, most precious resource, but surrendering any portion of it would further compromise their already precarious food security. "Perhaps you're weaving," Edmund suggested, seeing her dilemma. "Your linen work is the finest in the village." Eliza considered this possibility. She had indeed stored away several pieces of fine linen weaving, originally intended as offerings for the church at Easter, or perhaps as wedding gifts for young couples. The fabric represented countless hours of careful work at her loom during the long autumn evenings before winter's darkness limited such detailed labor. "I do have the altar cloth I began last summer," she said slowly, remembering the carefully pattern-woven linen stored in the wooden chest beneath their sleeping platform. "It is not yet complete, but the quality is good. The fishermen's wives always seek fine cloth." Edmund nodded approvingly. "They value what they cannot easily produce themselves." Eliza made her decision quickly. "Ned, William, take me to these fishermen. The daylight fades quickly, and we must make our trade before they depart." After bundling Agnes in every available layer and instructing her to tend the fire under Edmund's supervision, Eliza wrapped her precious cloth carefully in oiled leather to protect it from the snow. The woven piece represented weeks of painstaking labor, but that effort was worthless if her family starved before spring. Outside the village center showed more activity than Eliza had witnessed in weeks. A small crowd had gathered around 3 sturdy men dressed in thick furs, their weather-beaten faces marking them as outsiders from the more exposed settlements along the river's far shore. Behind them, sleds loaded with frozen fish testified to a successful expedition across the ice. They come every winter when the river freezes solid enough to bear their weight, Ned explained as they approached, clearly proud of his knowledge. Grandfather says they are the bravest men in the county, risking the ice for trade. Eliza observed the transactions already underway. A wheel of cheese exchanged for 3 large pike. A small sack of precious salt bartered for an entire sled section of smaller fish. The fishermen drove hard bargains, well aware that their goods represented rare protein to strengthen winter-weakened bodies. When her turn came, Eliza unwrapped her cloth with careful hands, allowing the intricate pattern to catch what remained of the afternoon light. The lead fisherman, a bearded giant of a man, examined it with unexpected delicacy, his rough fingers tracing the complex weaving with evident appreciation. "Fine work," he acknowledged, his accent thick but understandable. "Worth many fish, but not complete, yes. It lacks only the final border," Eliza confirmed. "Perhaps 2 more weeks of work, when light permits." The man considered this, then nodded decisively. 6 pike and 12 perch, he offered. "Or I take 4. Pike now, and you finish cloth by next winter crossing. Then to more pike." Eliza calculated swiftly. 6 large fish immediately would feed her family for nearly 2 weeks, properly rationed. But completing the cloth required time she could ill afford, with so many other urgent tasks demanding attention. 6 pike now, she counted, and I will add embroidery to the finished border when complete. The fisherman's eyes narrowed as he reassessed both her and the cloth. After a moment's consideration, he barked a laugh. "Bold woman, 5 pike now, good embroidery later." He extended his massive hand to seal the agreement. Eliza clasped it without hesitation. Agreed. Within minutes, 5 enormous pike were being loaded into a rough sack for her to carry home. The weight was considerable, but Eliza shouldered it gladly, the boys dancing around her with undisguised excitement at their family's good fortune. Their return to the hut was marked by a celebration of sorts. Edmund immediately set about preparing the first fish, his gnarled hands moving with surprising dexterity as he cleaned and filleted the frozen flesh. Thomas watched from his pallet, genuine relief softening his features for the first time in weeks. "We will smoke most of it," Edmund decided, already planning for maximum preservation. "Eat one fresh tonight. The smoke flavor will improve the others, and they will keep longer." That evening, they enjoyed their first substantial meal since Thomas's accident. The white fish flesh, simply prepared with their few remaining herbs and a precious pinch of salt, provided richness their bodies had been craving. Even Agnes, whose appetite had dwindled alarmingly during the worst food shortages, consumed her portion with evident enjoyment. "Will we survive until spring? Now, Mama?" she asked as Eliza tucked her into bed, her small voice serious in the firelit dimness. Eliza smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "We are stronger today than yesterday," she replied, "and tomorrow we will find new strength again." It was not a false promise. The traded cloth had secured them precious protein, but winter maintained its grip on their world with unrelenting harshness. Survival would continue to demand creativity, endurance, and perhaps most importantly, the support of their community. As if to emphasize this reality, the weather deteriorated again the following day. Wind drove icy particles through every crack in their walls, and temperatures plummeted so severely that water froze in their drinking cup if left more than a few feet from the fire. The improved diet had strengthened them somewhat, but each day still presented fresh challenges that tested their resilience. Thomas's recovery progressed steadily, though more slowly than he wished. By the third week after his accident, he had fashioned a crude crutch that allowed him limited mobility around their small dwelling, enough to relieve himself independently and occasionally tend the fire, but far from the vigorous capability needed for true labor. "The bone knits well," Widow Thatcher pronounced during her weekly examination, "but the muscles weaken from disuse. You must begin gentle movements of the legs soon, or you may never regain full strength." These exercises became part of their daily routine, careful stretches and small controlled movements that caused Thomas considerable pain but were necessary for proper healing. Eliza assisted him faithfully, providing both physical support and encouragement when discouragement threatened to overwhelm him. "I am half a man," he lamented one evening after a particularly difficult session left him sweating and nauseated. "With pain, how will I plow when spring comes? How will I rebuild our home?" "You will be whole again," Elisa assured him, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. "And you are never less than the man I married, whether standing on two legs or lying flat on your back." Her words seemed to reach something essential within him. Thomas captured her hand, pressing it against his chest where his heart beat steadily. "What would I do without you?" he asked softly. "You will never discover the answer to that question," she replied with a small smile, "for I have no intention of going anywhere." This exchange, simple as it was, marked a turning point in their shared experience of the winterest hardship. Something shifted between them, a deepening of connection, a recognition of mutual dependence that transcended their traditional roles. Thomas began asking for her input on decisions that previously he would have made unilaterally. Eliza found herself sharing burdens she would once have shouldered silently, drawing strength from their combined wisdom. Chapter the 9th of February arrived with a brief respite from winter's most brutal aspects. For 3 consecutive days, temperatures rose enough that snow began melting from south-facing surfaces, creating miniature waterfalls from roof edges and exposing patches of frozen ground where drifts had partially receded. "False spring," Edmund pronounced with the certainty of decades' experience. The old folks called it the fool's thaw. Winter will return with a vengeance before the month ends. Despite this warning, the temporary warming brought welcome opportunities. Eliza ventured further from their dwelling than had been possible in weeks, visiting neighboring families to check on their welfare and renew social connections strained by isolation. The children spent precious hours outdoors, their pale faces turned gratefully toward the strengthening sun, their bodies desperate for movement after long confinement. Even Thomas benefited from the milder conditions, with Eliza's support. On one side and his crutch on the other, he managed to walk slowly around the exterior of their home, assessing the damage winter had inflicted on the structure. The eastern wall must be completely rebuilt, he noted, frowning at the visible bowing of the mud and wattle surface, and the roof. He shook his head, observing how the thatching had compressed and deteriorated under repeated snow loads. "We will need new support beams before next winter. These have rotted beyond repair." Eliza nodded, making mental note of these observations. The list of necessary repairs grew longer each day, a daunting catalogue of tasks that would require substantial resources they did not possess. Yet each problem identified was one they could potentially solve, given sufficient time and community support. Their planning was interrupted by Agnes, who came running from where she had been playing with other village children near the common. "Well, Mama, Papa, riders are coming," she announced breathlessly. "Men on horses from the Lord's castle." Thomas and Eliza exchanged concerned glances. Representatives from the manor rarely brought good news for tenant farmers, particularly in winter when resources were at their excess. Often their arrival heralded additional taxation or labor requirements that could not be refused without severe consequences. "Help me back inside," Thomas requested grimly. "I should not be seen by the steward in this condition. He might question my ability to fulfill our planting obligations come spring." Eliza assisted him back to their dwelling, settling him on his pallet before straightening her clothing and hair as best she could. First impressions mattered greatly when dealing with the Lord's representatives. Any sign of excessive hardship might be interpreted as failure to manage their tenant obligations properly, while appearing too comfortable could prompt increased demands. She had barely completed these preparations when hoofbeats announced the rider's arrival in the village center. Curious despite her apprehension, Eliza stepped outside, joining other villagers who had gathered to discover the purpose of this unusual winter visitation. 3 men on horseback had reined in before the village headman's dwelling. The leader, instantly recognizable as Master Simeon, Lord Blackwood, a steward, sat rigidly upright on a grey palfrey, his fur-lined cloak and leather gloves marking his elevated status. Behind him, 2 armed guards created an imposing presence, a clear reminder of the manor's authority over their lives. "By order of Lord Blackwood," Master Simeon announced in a carrying voice once sufficient villagers had assembled. "Additional grain stores will be distributed to all tenant households registered in the manor accounts." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered crowd. Additional provisions from the Lord's stores during winter's leanness period represented unprecedented generosity. "Our Lord has received reports of extreme hardship following the unseasonable early freeze," the steward continued, his tone suggesting this charity reflected exceptional circumstances rather than ongoing obligation. "Each household will receive 1 quarter sack of rye, distributed tomorrow at midday from the village granary." The announcement concluded, Master Simeon unrolled a parchment and began reading names, requiring each household representative to acknowledge the notification. When Thomas Fletcher was called, Eliza stepped forward. "My husband is unwell," she explained, meeting the steward's cold gaze directly. "I will receive his portion." Master Simeon's eyes narrowed slightly. "The allocation is calculated based on able-bodied workers per household," he stated. "If Thomas cannot work his allotted acres come spring, the Lord must be informed immediately." "He will work," Eliza assured him firmly. "A broken leg heals. His strength returns daily." The steward studied her for a long moment before making a notation on his parchment. "See that it does," he replied curtly, before continuing with his list. When the officials had departed, the village erupted in cautious celebration. An unexpected reprieve from hunger, however temporary, represented cause for genuine rejoicing. Families who had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations now faced the prospect of actual bread, a luxury many had not tasted since midwinter celebrations had exhausted their flour supplies. "God has softened Lord Blackwood's heart," one woman declared, making the sign of the cross in gratitude. More likely, his steward informed him that dead tenants cannot plant spring crops, Edmund muttered when Eliza repeated this comment later. Self-interest often masquerades as charity among the nobility. Whatever the motivation, the distribution proceeded as promised the following day. Eliza joined the orderly queue at the village granary, Agnes's small hand clutched in hers, Ned and William following closely behind. The quarter sack of rye she received represented perhaps 2 weeks of bread for their family, not enough to eliminate concern about surviving until spring, but sufficient to substantially ease their most immediate fears. We should celebrate, she decided as they carried their precious allocation home. Actual bread tomorrow, fresh baked, not stretched with ground bark or acorns. The children's faces lit with excitement at this prospect. Real bread had become a distant memory, replaced by various unappetizing substitutes as flour supplies dwindled throughout the settlement. That evening, Elisa carefully measured a portion of the precious rye, setting it to soak overnight in preparation for baking. The remainder she stored in their strongest chest, securing the lid with a length of cord protection against both rodents and the temptation to use their stores too quickly. As she worked, she noticed Thomas watching her with an odd expression, something between pride and sadness shadowing his features. "What troubles you?" she asked, settling beside him once the children had been tucked into their bed. He hesitated before answering. "I have been the provider since we married," he said slowly. "My strength, my labor sustained us. Now I watch you shoulder burdens that should be mine, and I can offer little assistance." Eliza considered his words carefully, understanding the wounded pride behind them. "Do you recall the vow you made before Father Gregory on our wedding day?" she asked. "For better or worse, in sickness and in health. This is the worse, and the sickness our vows anticipated. My strength now is no different than yours when I birthed the children and could not leave my bed." Thomas nodded, slowly acknowledging the truth in her comparison. "Still, it changes how I see myself, and perhaps how you see me as well." "Yes," Eliza agreed simply. "I see you more clearly now than ever before. Not as the infallible provider whose strength never falters, but as a man of flesh and bone who bears his suffering with dignity and continues to lead our family with wisdom even from his sickbed." She took his hand, her calloused fingers intertwining with his. "We are partners in this life, Thomas. Sometimes you carry the heavier load, sometimes I do, but we move forward together, always." The intimacy of this exchange created a warmth between them that transcended their physical discomforts. For the remainder of that evening, they spoke of matters long left unaddressed, hopes for their children as futures, dreams of improvements to their home when resources permitted, even cautious plans for a small garden plot dedicated solely to medicinal herbs, inspired by Widow Thatcher's knowledge. The following day brought the promised treat of fresh bread, its yeasty aroma filling their humble dwelling as Eliza baked the loaves in their small clay oven. The simple pleasure of tearing into warm, crusty bread proved almost overwhelming. After weeks of deprivation, even Edmund, usually stoic in his enjoyment of meals, closed his eyes in evident bliss as he chewed his portion slowly, savoring each bite. "This reminds me of my mother's baking," he commented, an unusual sharing of personal memory from the typically reticent old man. She could coax bread from the poorest flour, yet somehow make it taste fit for the Lord's table. This rare glimpse into Edmund's past prompted similar reminiscences from Thomas, who began recounting tales from his childhood that Eliza had never heard before, stories of his mother's cleverness during previous harsh winters, traditional skills now largely forgotten, small moments of joy carved from difficult circumstances. The children listened attentively to these family histories, absorbing not just the specific information but the underlying message of resilience across generations. Without explicit instruction, they were learning their most important lesson: survival required not just physical endurance, but the preservation of human connection and shared knowledge. "Tell us how you and Mama met," Ned requested as they finished their bread, clearly eager to extend this unusual opportunity for family storytelling. Thomas smiled, glancing at Eliza with a warmth that momentarily erased the lines of pain etched around his eyes. "It was harvest time, 7 summers past," he began. "Your mother came with her family from the western village to help with the Lord S. fields, as is custom when extra hands are needed." And so the day that had begun with bread continued with nourishment of a different kind. The strengthening of family bonds through shared narrative, the weaving of their individual struggles into a larger tapestry of collective experience. Outside, winter maintained its grip on the landscape, but within their humble dwelling, something vital was blossoming despite the frozen ground. Chapter 10. True to Edmund's prediction, the fall spring proved fleeting. Within a week, temperatures plummeted again, and fresh snow blanketed the briefly exposed landscape. The harsh conditions returned with a vengeance that seemed almost personal, as if winter resented their brief reprieve and sought to punish such premature optimism. This renewed assault brought fresh challenges. Their carefully rationed firewood dwindled faster than anticipated as they struggled to maintain sufficient warmth in their dwelling. The fish secured through Eliza's weaving had been consumed. Their bones boiled repeatedly for soup before finally being discarded. Even the precious rye from Lord Blackwood's distribution had diminished to a small portion reserved for Thomas S. strengthening bread, deemed essential for his continued recovery. Yet despite these hardships, subtle changes had occurred within their family unit, changes that proved crucial to their ongoing survival. The children, observing their parents' partnership and Edmund's contributions, had begun assuming greater responsibilities without prompting. Ned regularly assisted with tending the fire, displaying mature awareness of how to achieve maximum heat from minimal fuel. William had developed a surprising talent for snare setting under Edmund's tutelage, occasionally securing small game that supplemented their meager meals. Even little Agnes found purpose in simple tasks, sorting nettles and other winter-dormant plants that Edmund identified as edible when properly prepared. Thomas's recovery had progressed sufficiently that he now managed limited movement around their dwelling without assistance, though extended activity remained beyond his capability. More significantly, his mental state had transformed from frustrated dependency to engaged problem-solving. Unable to contribute physical labor, he instead offered strategic thinking about resource management and repair prioritization for when weather-permitted exterior work. "The roof must come first," he insisted during one evening discussion. "Walls can be patched more easily, but a compromised roof leaves everything vulnerable." "The eastern wall cannot wait another season," Edmund countered, pointing to the increasingly visible bulge in the mud and wattle structure. "One more freeze-thaw cycle and it may collapse entirely." Such practical debates occupied many evening hours, creating purpose and forward momentum despite their continued confinement. Eliza participated fully in these planning sessions, her practical knowledge of household management complementing Thomas's construction expertise and Edmund's weather wisdom. One particularly brutal morning in late February, Eliza awoke to find their water bucket frozen solid despite its proximity to the banked overnight fire. The temperature had dropped so severely that frost patterns decorated the interior walls of their dwelling, and their breath formed visible clouds even near the hearth. The children cannot rise yet, she decided, assessing the dangerous cold. Keep them beneath the blankets until the fire builds strength. Edmund nodded agreement, already working to revive the carefully preserved embers from the previous evening. His gnarled hands moved with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling to maximize the small flame's growth potential. Thomas stirred from his pallet, grimacing as he pushed himself upright. "This cold rivals anything in my memory," he observed, his voice rough with sleep. "Even the great freeze when I was a boy seems mild by comparison." Eliza moved to the small window opening, brushing aside the cloth covering to peer outside. The scene that greeted her was eerily beautiful, the entire visible world transformed into crystalline whiteness, trees encased in ice that shimmered. In the early morning light, smoke from neighboring chimneys rising in perfectly vertical columns in the still air. "No one will venture out today unless absolutely necessary," she predicted, securing the cloth covering to minimize draft. "We must." Her statement was interrupted by an urgent knocking at their door. Exchanging surprised glances with Thomas, Eliza moved quickly to answer, admitting a blast of incredibly cold air along with Walter, the blacksmith's son, whose beard and eyebrows were white with frost despite the short distance he must have traveled. "Widow Collins's fire has died completely," he announced without preamble, his words emerging in visible puffs. "She cannot restart it alone, and her dwelling grows colder by the minute. Father Gregory asks if she might shelter with you until we can properly warm her home again." "Of course," Eliza replied immediately. "Thomas, can we spare any heated stones to place in her bed for warming?" Thomas was already directing William to fetch the smooth river stones they kept near the fire specifically for such purposes. "Wrap them in cloth," he instructed, "and bring the rabbit-skin blanket for her as well." Within minutes, they had prepared a space for the elderly woman near their hearth. Walter departed to assist with bringing her to their dwelling, leaving the family to make what additional preparations they could with their limited resources. "She will need hot liquid immediately upon arrival," Edmund advised, already setting water to heat. "The cold settles in old bones more deeply than you youngsters can imagine." Eliza nodded, adding precious pine needles to the heating water to create a warming tea. As she worked, the realization struck her forcefully. They were now in position to offer assistance rather than merely receive it. Despite their continued precariousness, they had achieved sufficient stability to extend aid to another in greater need. Profound reversal of their circumstances earlier in the winter. When Widow Collins arrived, half carried between Walter and Father Gregory, her condition confirmed the wisdom of their preparations. The elderly woman's face had taken on a bluish tinge, her thin body trembling uncontrollably despite multiple layers of clothing. "Be blessed be this house," she stammered through chattering teeth as they settled her near the fire. "Forgive the imposition, ... "There is no imposition among neighbors," Thomas assured her firmly. "Our home is yours for as long as needed." Agnes, evidently remembering how the widow had taught her string games during their previous communal arrangement, immediately brought her small wooden doll as offering. "You can hold her," the child suggested seriously. "She is very warm." This simple gesture of childish generosity seemed to affect Widow Collins more profoundly than the physical warmth, gradually returning color to her features. Tears, briefly, welled in her faded eyes before she composed herself, accepting both the doll and the steaming cup of pine tea Eliza offered. Such kindness, she murmured. "The Lord sees and remembers." Father Gregory, who had remained to ensure the widow's safe installation, nodded approvingly at the family's response to this emergency. "This is Christ's teaching made manifest," he observed. "When I was cold, you warmed me. When hungry, you fed me." After the priest departed to check on other vulnerable parishioners, Widow Collins gradually recovered enough to explain how her fire had extinguished overnight despite her precautions. "My hands grow too stiff too properly. Arrange the kindling," she admitted, "and my eyes fail me in dimness. I should have sought help yesterday when the coals began weakening." "Pride is a luxury of summer," Edmund commented with the authority of similarly advanced age. "In winter, wisdom lies in acknowledging limitations." The widow nodded rueful agreement. "I have outlived my usefulness," she sighed. "Once I helped others. Now I am but a burden." "Nonsense," Eliza contradicted firmly. "Did you not teach Agnes and 3 other children to card wool just last month? Did your knowledge of preserving not save the miller's entire apple harvest from spoiling? Your usefulness merely changes form, like water to ice and back again." This perspective seemed to comfort the elderly woman, who gradually engaged in conversation with Edmund about traditional weather prediction methods, a discussion that revealed surprising overlaps and differences in their respective family knowledge. The children listened attentively, absorbing information that might never be recorded in books, yet held critical survival value in their rural existence. For the remainder of that brutally cold day, their dwelling functioned as an intergenerational knowledge exchange as much as physical shelter. Widow Collins, warmed by fire and human connection, shared techniques for dyeing wool using winter-available materials. Edmund demonstrated his method for predicting freeze duration by observing subtle changes in smoke patterns. Thomas contributed architectural insights gained from building experiences in 3 different villages throughout his younger years. Elisa, preparing their evening meal from increasingly limited stores, reflected on how adversity had transformed them all. Thomas, once defined primarily by his physical strength, now contributed through wisdom and planning. Edmund, previously viewed mainly as an additional mouth to feed, had revealed himself as an invaluable repository of practical knowledge. The children, rather than representing solely burden and vulnerability, increasingly functioned as active participants in their collective survival. And she herself had discovered capacities previously unrealized or undervalued: leadership in crisis, creative problem-solving, and the ability to maintain family cohesion under extreme pressure. None of these developments would have emerged during normal times, when traditional roles and routines structured their existence predictably. That night, with Widow Collins installed in a makeshift bed near the fire and the family clustered more tightly to accommodate their guest, Eliza found herself strangely grateful despite their continued hardships. Something precious had been forged during these brutal months: a deeper understanding of interdependence, a more authentic appreciation for each family member's contributions, a clearer recognition of community as essential rather than supplemental to survival. Outside, temperatures continued to plummet, creating conditions that threatened bare survival. Inside their humble dwelling, however, these 7 souls, spanning from Agnes's 4 years to Widow Collins' 7 decades, had created a microclimate of human resilience that defied winter's most vicious assault. Chapter 11. The brutal cold maintained its grip for nearly a week, creating conditions so severe that even the simplest outdoor tasks became potentially lethal. Breathing the frozen air caused immediate pain in the lungs. Exposed skin risked frostbite within minutes. The snow acquired a crystalline quality that reflected sunlight with blinding intensity. During this period, Widow Collins remained with them, her own dwelling deemed unsafe until temperatures moderated enough for proper repairs to her fire pit and smoke vent. Her presence proved unexpectedly beneficial, particularly for Agnes, who blossomed under the elderly woman's patient attention. The widow taught the child intricate finger games that required no special equipment, traditional rhymes and simple songs that distracted from hunger pangs, and basic techniques for spinning wool using just a simple stick spindle. "You have cleverness in your hands," the widow observed as Agnes successfully twisted sheep's wool into a surprisingly even thread. "Such a gift serves a woman well throughout life." Edmund and the widow developed a companionable routine of sharing weather wisdom each morning. Combining their observations of subtle signs, most younger people overlooked the particular quality of morning light. The behavior of the few birds hardy enough to remain active, the sound snow made underfoot during brief, necessary excursions outside. "March approaches," Edmund announced one morning after their customary exchange. "The light changes, though the cold remains." Indeed, Widow Collins agreed. The days lengthen noticeably now. Spring gathers strength below the snow, invisible but certain. This assurance of eventual seasonal change provided crucial psychological sustenance during a period when physical resources dwindled alarmingly. Their firewood supply, despite careful rationing, had diminished to a quantity sufficient for perhaps another night. Food stores had become so limited that Eliza now prepared just one meal daily, thin gruels served at midday, when the fire burned strongest and bodies most needed sustenance to combat the cold. "We must find additional wood," Thomas stated one evening, calculating their remaining supply against the likely duration of winter conditions. "Without fire, nothing else matters." "The forest lies buried in snow deeper than a man's height," Edmund reminded him, "and the deadfall nearest the village was gathered months ago." "There is another source," Ned suggested hesitantly. All eyes turned to the boy, surprised by his intervention in an adult conversation. "The abandoned cottage beyond the stream, the one where the chandler lived before moving to town. Walter said most of the roof has collapsed, but the walls and interior beams remain." Thomas considered this suggestion with obvious interest. Salvaging wood from abandoned structures is not theft, he reasoned, if the owner has truly departed permanently. "Jonas the chandler died at Michaelmas," Widow Collins confirmed. "His son sold the wax-making equipment and moved to his wife's village. The cottage reverts to the Lord, but it stands beyond the regularly patrolled boundary." A plan quickly formed. Edmund would remain with Thomas, Widow Collins, and Agnes, maintaining what heat they could from their dwindling supply. Eliza would accompany Ned and William to assess the abandoned cottage and salvage what suitable wood they could transport home. "Take the hand sledge," Thomas instructed, his expression betraying concern despite his practical tone, "and the sharpest axe. Frozen wood splits differently aim for the joints where beams connect rather than attempting to break the main timbers." Early the following morning, with sunrise barely illuminating the snow-covered landscape, Eliza set out with the two boys. All three were bundled in every available layer of clothing, with cloth wrapped around their lower faces to warm the air before it reached their lungs. The small hand sledge, ordinarily used for transporting water or goods from the village center, scraped along behind them through the crusted snow. The journey to the abandoned cottage proved more arduous than anticipated. What would have been a 30-minute walk in summer conditions became a grueling 2-hour expedition through snow that alternately supported their weight and suddenly gave way, plunging them hip-deep into hidden pockets beneath the surface crust. When they finally reached their destination, the cottage-esque condition confirmed both the potential and the challenge of their salvage mission. The thatched roof had indeed partially collapsed, exposing interior beams to the elements. Those timbers now bore a thick coating of ice and snow, requiring substantial effort to even access properly. "We must work quickly but carefully," Eliza instructed, assessing both the structural stability and their limited daylight. "Ned, clear snow from that fallen section, while William and I determine which beams can be safely removed without bringing down more of the structure." For the next several hours, they worked methodically, clearing snow, identifying salvageable wood, and carefully detaching what pieces they could manage with their limited tools. The intense cold actually aided certain aspects of their tasks frozen. Joints sometimes separated more cleanly than they would in warmer conditions, and the solid ground provided stability for their efforts. By midday, they had accumulated an impressive pile of usable timber, several roof beams, portions of interior wall framing, and even some sections of sturdy furniture abandoned by the previous occupants. The hand sledge would not accommodate all their findings in a single trip, requiring difficult decisions about priorities. "We take the driest pieces first," Elisa determined, selecting timber that had been protected from the worst weather exposure. "We can return tomorrow for the remainder if conditions permit." The return journey proved even more challenging than their outward trek. The sledge, heavily laden with salvaged wood, required all three of them pulling together to navigate the uneven terrain. Progress slowed to a painful crawl as afternoon light began fading, raising Elisa's anxiety about completing their journey before darkness added danger to their already precarious situation. "We must rest," she finally conceded when William stumbled for the third time in as many minutes, his young face flushed with exhaustion despite the bitter cold. "Just briefly, to recover our strength." They paused in the shelter of a large oak tree where the snow depth had been somewhat reduced by the canopy above. Eliza distributed small pieces of hard bread. She had prudently brought for such contingency their only food since the previous evening's meager meal. As they huddled together, sharing body heat and this simple sustenance, Eliza found herself struck by her son's resilience. Neither boy had complained once throughout the difficult expedition, despite conditions that would challenge grown men. Ned, at 8, pulled the sledge with determination equal to her own. William, barely 6, had worked alongside them gathering smaller pieces of wood without flagging until physical exhaustion finally overwhelmed his willpower. "You both make me very proud," she told them simply, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Few grown men would show such courage and endurance. Both boys straightened slightly at this praise, visible pride temporarily overcoming their fatigue. After a brief rest, they resumed their journey with renewed determination, finally reaching their home as the last daylight faded from the western sky. Thomas had been watching anxiously for their return, his relief evident as they dragged the laden sledge the final distance to their door. Edmund and Widow Collins immediately helped unload their precious cargo, while Agnes danced around them with excitement disproportionate to the actual achievement but perfectly aligned with their desperate need. Enough for at least another week, Edmund estimated, examining their haul with approving eyes. Possibly more if weather moderates soon. "There remains twice this amount at the cottage," Eliza reported, warming her frozen hands before the carefully maintained fire. "But Another expedition cannot be attempted tomorrow. The boys need recovery time. Indeed, both Ned and William had collapsed onto their sleeping pallets immediately after entering the relative warmth of their dwelling, their exhaustion too profound for even hunger to override. Eliza covered them with every available blanket, concerned by how deeply chilled they had become during the final portion of their journey. "You should not have risked the children," Thomas said quietly, when they had moment apart from the others. His tone held worry rather than accusation, but the underlying criticism was unmistakable. "They are stronger than we realize," Eliza replied, keeping her voice equally low, "and I could not manage alone. The alternative was watching our fire die while wood stood available for taking." Thomas subsided, acknowledging the impossible choices their circumstances created. After a moment, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her chilled skin. "You did what was necessary," he conceded, "as you have done throughout this winter." That night, as the family settled into sleep warmed by their salvaged timber, Eliza found herself contemplating the complex moral calculations survival demanded. Under normal circumstances, allowing children to participate in such physically demanding and potentially dangerous labor would be unconscionable. Yet their current reality rendered traditional protections impossible to maintain. Participating in essential tasks gave the boys agency in their own survival rather than relegating them to passive dependence. Similarly, salvaging materials from an abandoned dwelling skated the edges of proper behavior. Despite the technical permissibility Widow Collins had identified, their desperate need justified actions that more comfortable circumstances would have rendered unnecessary or unthinkable. What other compromises might be required before winter released its grip? How would these experiences shape her children's understanding of right and wrong, of acceptable risk versus foolhardy danger, of community obligation versus family preservation? These questions followed Elisa into uneasy dreams, where summer, abundance and winter scarcity battled for dominance in landscapes both familiar and fantastical. When she awoke before dawn, her mind felt clearer despite minimal rest. One certainty had crystallized during her troubled sleep. They would survive this winter. The path forward remained treacherous, but her conviction about their ultimate endurance had solidified into unshakable certainty. Chapter the 12th of March arrived with contradictory conditions that tested even Edmund's extensive weather wisdom. Days of bitter cold alternated with brief periods of relative warmth. Snow melted partially during daylight hours only to refreeze overnight, creating treacherous ice sheets across the village pathways. The constant freeze-thaw cycle stressed their dwelling's already compromised structure, causing new cracks to appear in the eastern wall and expanding existing vulnerabilities. "The wall cannot last another month," Thomas pronounced after a particularly alarming shift caused a section of mud and wattle to slough away completely, creating a gap through which daylight visibly penetrated. "We must attempt repairs before the next heavy precipitation." This assessment presented a formidable challenge. Proper repairs required unfrozen mud, which remained impossible given the persistent freezing temperatures. Additionally, Thomas's recovery, while progressing steadily, had not yet advanced sufficiently for him to undertake such physically demanding work himself. "Perhaps we could temporarily cover the gap with," Elisa's suggestion trailed off as she mentally inventoried their meager possessions, finding nothing suitable for the purpose that wasn't already serving an essential function. "The abandoned cottage," Ned suggested, now fully recovered from the previous expedition. The interior walls had clay coverings still attached to wattle sections. If we could remove some intact, this innovative proposal sparked immediate Planning. Widow Collins had returned to her own dwelling once weather permitted proper repairs to her fire pit, leaving them with slightly more space, but one fewer contributor to daily survival tasks. Edmund volunteered to accompany Eliza and the boys on this second salvage mission, arguing that his knowledge of traditional building techniques would prove valuable in identifying and carefully removing usable wall sections. Thomas, reluctantly, agreed to remain behind with Agnes, his frustration at continued incapacity evident despite his rational acceptance of physical limitations. Take the rope and the broad knife for separating the clay panels, he instructed as they prepared for departure the following morning. And remember that the north-facing interior walls will likely have suffered less moisture damage than those facing south. Their second expedition to the abandoned cottage proved marginally easier than the first, the path somewhat packed down from their previous journey. Upon arriving, they discovered that recent weather fluctuations had partially cleared snow from the structure, revealing additional salvage opportunities they had previously overlooked. There, Edmund indicated, pointing to an interior corner where two walls met at right angles. That section remains well protected from elements. The clay appears intact, with minimal cracking. Working carefully under Edmund's direction, they managed to detach several sections of plastered wattle, approximately 2 feet square regular, but potentially suitable for patching their own damaged wall. They also discovered a cache of dried reeds stored in what had once been the Chandler S. workshop, perfect for reinforcing their repairs. A gift from Providence, Edmund declared, examining the reeds with evident satisfaction. Perfectly seasoned and protected from moisture. Better material than we could harvest ourselves, even in summer. Loading their treasures onto the hand sledge required careful arrangement to avoid damage during transport. By early afternoon, they had secured their finds and begun the return journey, making better time than during their previous attempt, thanks to the more established path and slightly warmer conditions. They arrived home to find an unexpected visitor keeping company with Thomas and Agnes Walter, bearing news that simultaneously encouraged and complicated their situation. The river ice breaks along the eastern bend, he reported, accepting the cup of hot water flavored with pine needles. That was the only refreshment they could offer. Master Fletcher says if warming continues, the mill pond will thaw enough to operate the wheel within a fortnight. This development represented significant progress toward normal village functioning. The watermill provided not only flour grinding, but powered the Fuller S hammers and other essential mechanical operations that had been suspended throughout winter. More importantly, Walter continued, lowering his voice slightly, travelers from the south report early growth in protected valleys, young nettles, chickweed, and even wild garlic appearing where snow has receded. This news electrified the family. Early spring greens represented both vital nutrition after months of increasingly inadequate diet, and the first tangible sign that winter's grip was truly loosening. After months of deprivation, the prospect of fresh vegetation, however humble, seemed almost miraculous. We must organize foraging expeditions as soon as conditions permit, Thomas decided, his expression more animated than it had been in weeks. The southern slope beyond the mill stream receives stronger sun exposure. Vegetation will appear there first. I know where to look, Edmund offered eagerly. My mother showed me the hidden places where spring arrives earliest. Knowledge, passed through generations. Planning this foraging expedition provided focus for their evening conversation, temporarily diverting attention from their ongoing challenges. Even the children contributed observations about locations where snow seemed to melt first during brief, warm periods, demonstrating their deepening environmental awareness. The following morning brought both promise and setback. Overnight temperatures had remained above freezing for the first time in months. Significant meteorological shift. However, this warming triggered exactly what Thomas had feared. The damaged section of their eastern wall collapsed completely, creating an opening nearly 4 feet wide that exposed their interior to the elements. "We must repair immediately," Thomas declared, attempting to rise using his crutch before the next precipitation. "You cannot manage such work yet," Elisa countered firmly, already organizing the salvaged materials from the previous day's expedition. "Direct us. From here, your knowledge guides our hands." Though clearly frustrated by his limitations, Thomas accepted this arrangement, providing detailed instructions as Eliza, Edmund, and the boys began the urgent repair process. Working steadily throughout the day, they managed to create a reasonably secure patch using the salvaged wattle sections, reinforced with the dried reeds. Mud mixed with straw and animal dung from the village common provided binding material, though in the cool temperatures it dried slowly and imperfectly. "It will hold," Edmund assessed late that afternoon, stepping back to evaluate their work. "Not permanently, but until true spring allows proper rebuilding." This partial victory lifted their spirits temporarily, but the following days brought new challenges as weather patterns continued their unstable transition towards spring. Rain replaced snow initially, a welcome change until they discovered multiple leaks in their patched roof. Water dripped steadily into carefully positioned containers, creating constant dampness that permeated their dwelling and threatened the precious dry firewood they had so laboriously salvaged. Simultaneously, the path to the village center became nearly impassable as accumulated snow transformed into deep mud, isolating them further just as community activity began increasing. With the seasonal shift, reports reached them of early planting preparations in the Lord S. fields, of migratory birds returning to nearby marshes, of distant hillsides showing faint greeningle, tantalizing indications of revival occurring just beyond their limited mobility. Most concerning, their food supplies had reached critically low levels. The delay in vegetation growth created by the unusually harsh winter meant forageable plants remained unavailable despite the calendar's advancement into traditional early harvesting period. Game animals, similarly affected by extended winter conditions, remained scarce, and those few spotted appeared dangerously thin themselves. "We must attempt fishing in the millstream," Thomas suggested when their evening meal had dwindled to little more than hot water flavored with the last of their dried herbs. The flowing water thaws first, and fish often gather where currents move fastest. This suggestion led to another innovation. Ned and William, under Edmund's guidance, fashioned crude fishing spears from salvaged wood and metal fragments recovered from the abandoned cottage. The design represented an amalgamation of Edmund's childhood memories, Thomas's practical suggestions, and the boys' own creative adaptations. Their first fishing expedition yielded modest but crucial success: 3 small trout speared in the partially thawed millstream. The catch provided their first animal protein in nearly 2 weeks. The flesh divided with mathematical precision to ensure each family member received equal nourishment. Even the bones and heads became valuable additions to their cooking pot, extracting every possible calorie from their hard-won prize. This small victory reinforced their growing understanding. Survival required constant adaptation, combining traditional knowledge with innovative approaches that responded to their specific circumstances. No single strategy, hunting, gathering, salvaging, trading, provided complete security. Only through diverse efforts, continuously adjusted based on changing conditions, could they navigate the treacherous transition between winter S grip and spring S uncertain arrival. As March progressed, these adaptations multiplied. They developed a system for capturing rainwater from their leaking roof, providing both drinking water and cleaning liquid without treacherous journeys to the increasingly muddy village well. William displayed unexpected talent for weaving fish traps from salvaged reeds under Edmund's instruction, gradually increasing their protein acquisition. Ned established himself as the family's most successful forager, his keen eyes spotting edible growth days before others noticed its emergence. Most remarkably, Thomas's enforced immobility had transformed into a different kind of contribution. Unable to perform physical labor, he instead developed a comprehensive planning system for spring recovery, detailed schedules for planting, building repairs, and resource acquisition that optimized their limited capabilities in the crucial weeks ahead. "The eastern field should receive our first seed," he explained, sketching plot layouts in the packed earth floor with a stick. "It drains better than the western section, allowing earlier working of soil. We must request plowing assistance from neighbors immediately when ground permits." This strategic thinking, previously overshadowed by Thomas's physical capabilities, now emerged as perhaps his most valuable contribution to family survival. While many neighbors formulated only vague intentions for spring recovery, their household developed precise, prioritized approaches that would maximize efficiency during the critical planting period. "You see farther than most," Eliza observed one evening as Thomas detailed his rotational grazing plan for their single remaining goat. "Others react to immediate needs. You build a path to future security." Thomas considered this assessment. Thoughtfully, "Perhaps my injury served some purpose beyond mere suffering," he replied. Forced stillness creates space for deeper consideration. When the body cannot act, the mind travels paths previously unexplored. This philosophical observation reflected broader changes occurring throughout their family. Each member had developed new capabilities, discovered hidden strengths, and established different relationships with one another through their shared ordeal. The hierarchy that had governed their pre-winter existence, Thomas as unquestioned authority, Eliza as household manager, Edmund as aging dependent, children as primarily burdens requiring protection, had evolved into a more integrated functioning, where each person's unique contributions received appropriate recognition. By late March, subtle but unmistakable signs heralded winter's retreat, not into immediate springtime abundance, but toward the messy, chaotic transition period that peasants termed the starving time, those difficult weeks when winter stores approached exhaustion but spring growth had not yet reached sustaining levels. Surviving this final challenge would require all the resilience, creativity, and mutual support they had developed throughout the preceding months. Chapter 13. The first truly warm day arrived in early April, bringing sunshine strong enough to be felt as heat against the skin rather than merely illumination. Muddy pathways began firming underfoot, allowing easier movement throughout the village. Birdsong increased noticeably at dawn and dusk as migratory species returned to their seasonal territories. For Eliza's family, this warming brought both relief and intensified activity. Thomas had progressed to walking short distances without his crutch, though he still relied on it for longer journeys. His increased mobility allowed greater participation in outdoor tasks. lifting spirits that had flagged during his enforced confinement. The Michaelmas field shows promising soil conditions. He reported after his first independent inspection of their primary planting area. Another week of similar weather should permit initial turning of earth. This assessment triggered accelerated preparations for the planting season. Seeds carefully preserved from previous harvests required sorting and testing for viability. Tools neglected during winter needed cleaning and repair. The complex choreography of spring agricultural activities demanded meticulous planning to maximize their limited resources and Thomas S. still restricted physical capabilities. Simultaneously, wild food sources began emerging in quantities sufficient for meaningful harvesting. Eliza organized daily foraging expeditions with family members targeting different areas based on their specialized knowledge. Edmund focused on woodland edges, where certain mushroom varieties appeared earliest. Ned had developed remarkable skill at locating wild onion patches. Agnes, supervised by William, gathered tender dandelion greens from south-facing slopes. These collective efforts gradually increased their nutritional intake, though true abundance remained distant. Most foraged items produced small yields requiring careful allocation, a handful of greens here, a few roots there, occasionally supplemented by fish caught in their increasingly effective traps. The family remained thin, their bodies bearing visible evidence of winter's deprivations. But progressive improvement in energy and general health became noticeable with each passing day. Their dwelling, too, showed signs of recovery and adaptation. With warmer temperatures allowing proper preparation of building materials, they undertook more substantial repairs to the damaged eastern wall. Thomas directed the work from a seated position, his experienced eye guiding Eliza and Edmund through proper technique for mud application and wattle reinforcement. The foundation stones must be repositioned first, he instructed, pointing to where frost heaving had displaced the base structure. Without solid foundation, all other repairs proved temporary. This wisdom applied beyond mere building technique. Throughout the village, families were reassessing their foundations, both physical and metaphorical, after winter as harsh testing. Some households emerged relatively intact, their preparations having proven adequate for the challenges faced. Others suffered devastating losses, with empty places at hearths marking winter's most tragic consequences. Widow Thatcher says 3 more died in the outlying cottages, Edmund reported after a rare visit to the village centre. Old Simon, the charcoal burner, young Martha, who married last Whitsuntide, and her newborn son. Such news reinforced their gratitude for their own survival, while simultaneously heightening awareness of continuing vulnerability. Though spring advanced steadily, genuine security remained distant. Food scarcity would continue until crops matured months later. Building materials for proper structural repairs competed with agricultural necessities for limited time and energy. Physical recovery from winter's deprivations progressed slowly, particularly for Thomas, whose healing represented their most critical restoration project. The bone knits well, but muscles remember long disuse, Widow Thatcher observed during her examination of his leg. You must continue regular movement while avoiding excessive strain. Balance today's needs against tomorrow's capabilities. This principle, balancing immediate requirements against long-term sustainability, guided their entire spring transition. When foraging opportunities presented particularly abundant yields, they preserved portions rather than consuming everything immediately. When favorable weather created perfect planting conditions, they parceled their labor to avoid exhaustion that would compromise subsequent days' productivity. When neighbors offered assistance with heavy tasks, they accepted graciously while identifying future opportunities to reciprocate appropriately. "We build not just for this season, but for winters yet to come," Thomas reminded them during a family council discussing seed allocation. "What we plant now shapes possibilities far beyond autumn harvest." As April advanced toward May, signs of renewal multiplied throughout their environment. Fruit trees in the village orchard displayed delicate blossoms promising future abundance. Fields transitioned from brown to faint green as planted grains sprouted in carefully tended rows. Livestock thinned by winter as hardships began regaining condition on fresh pasturage, with new lambs and kids appearing in peasant holdings, fortunate enough to maintain breeding stock through the leanest period. For their particular family, perhaps the most significant renewal came in Thomas's relationship with the land itself. Having spent months observing the seasonal transition from forced immobility, he developed heightened awareness of subtle environmental patterns previously overlooked in his busy physical engagement with farming tasks. "Notice how morning dew lingers longest in that slight depression," he pointed out to Ned during a slow circuit of their planting area. "Such moisture differences indicate soil variations requiring different treatment. The shallow-rooted crops belong there, where brief dampness benefits without promoting rot." This deepened observational capacity transformed Thomas's agricultural approach. Rather than merely replicating traditional methods learned from his father, he began adapting techniques based on specific conditions observed within their particular land allotment. Some innovations proved immediately successful. Others required adjustment through trial and error. All reflected a fundamental shift in his relationship with their environment from unconscious application of inherited practices toward conscious partnership with natural systems. "The land speaks if we learn its language," he explained to Elisa as they surveyed their early plantings one evening in late April. "My injury created unwelcome silence in body, but unexpected listening in mind." Similar transformations had occurred throughout their family. Edmund, previously viewed primarily as an aging dependent whose contributions belonged to the past, had established himself as an irreplaceable repository of traditional ecological knowledge information critically valuable during their winter survival and spring recovery. His understanding of plant behaviors, wildlife patterns, and weather indicators now received proper recognition as essential wisdom rather than mere elderly reminiscence. The children, too, had evolved beyond their pre-winter identities. Necessity had accelerated their development of practical skills, but more significantly, their self-perception had transformed. They no longer functioned as passive recipients of adult protection, but as active contributors to family survival, each developing distinct capabilities that earned genuine respect rather than merely indulgent encouragement. Even Agnes, at 4 years old, had internalized this collaborative family identity. "I help too," she would announce seriously when assigned simple tasks like sorting seeds or gathering cooking herbs near their dwelling. Her contributions might be objectively small, but her inclusion in meaningful work, rather than mere diversion, represented a fundamental shift in family functioning. Eliza herself experienced perhaps the most profound transformation, though recognizing it fully required others' observations. "You stand differently now," Thomas commented one evening as she returned from organizing a communal planting effort involving 3 neighboring families. "More upright, more certain." This physical manifestation reflected deeper changes. In her self-conception, the Winter S challenges had demanded leadership capacities previously unexpressed, strategic thinking traditionally considered outside her domain, and physical endurance beyond prior expectations. Meeting these demands had permanently altered her understanding of her own capabilities and rightful role within both family and broader community. By early May, when the church bells rang to celebrate Rogation Sunday, their household had established a new equilibrium that incorporated Winter S, harsh lessons without being defined solely by privation. Fields carefully planted with diverse crops promised future harvest. Their dwelling, while still requiring substantial repairs beyond current resources, had been stabilized sufficiently for immediate security. Thomas S. recovery had progressed to approximately three-quarters normal function, with continuous improvement promising eventual full restoration. Most importantly, they had developed resilience rooted not merely in physical preparations but in adaptive capacity. The ability to respond creatively to unexpected challenges through collaborative problem-solving, knowledge integration across generations, and recognition of each person's unique contributions to collective survival. As Eliza stood listening to the church bells with her family gathered around her, she reflected on Winter S' paradoxical gift. The season that had threatened their existence most severely had simultaneously revealed their greatest strengths. The bitter cold that nearly destroyed them had forged new capabilities, deeper connections, and more authentic appreciation for both human interdependence and the natural world's complex patterns. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative expression as the final bell tones faded across the greening landscape. "That we are not merely survivors," she replied, watching Agnes chase a butterfly through fresh spring grass. "We are changed in ways that matter beyond mere continuation." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately the deeper meaning beneath her simple statement. "Winter strips everything to essentials," he said. "What remains reveals true nature more clearly than comfort ever could." Their shared understanding required no further elaboration. Together with Edmund and the children, they turned toward home, moving at a pace accommodating Thomas's still healing leg. Ahead of them stretched the complex challenges of rebuilding, replanting, and full recovery, a journey requiring months of sustained effort before true security could be claimed. Yet unlike the frightened family that had faced winter's onset with inadequate preparations and limited understanding, they now approached these challenges with hard-won wisdom, proven adaptability, and unshakable confidence in their collective capacity to meet whatever difficulties might arise. Winter had tested them severely, but ultimately failed to break what mattered most: the human bonds and adaptive intelligence that represented their most essential survival resources. The season that had nearly destroyed them had, paradoxically, revealed and strengthened their truest nature. In this unexpected transformation lay perhaps Winter's most valuable gift: not mere survival, but profound renewal of what it meant to be fully human in a challenging world. Epilogue 5 years later, on a bitter January night with snow piling against the walls of their rebuilt dwelling, Eliza sat before a well-stocked fire, working wool into yarn with practiced hands. The renovated home bore little resemblance to the fragile structure that had barely sheltered them during that legendary harsh winter half a decade earlier. Sturdy stone now reinforced the foundation and lower walls. Properly sealed windows with oiled parchment coverings emitted light while minimizing drafts. The roof, completely rebuilt with Thomas's improved design, supported snow loads without the ominous creaking that had once signaled potential collapse. Most significantly, their interior space had nearly doubled through careful expansion during successive building seasons. Their family had grown as well-twin boys born the spring following the great winter now slept peacefully in the new sleeping alcove alongside their older siblings. Thomas entered from the adjoining storage room, his arms laden with split logs. For the night spire, though he still walked with a slight limp in cold weather, his strength had fully returned, his frame once again solid with the muscle mass of active farming labor. "The wind shifts northward," he reported, arranging the wood neatly beside the hearth. "We can expect 3 days of deep cold, according to Edmund's prediction." At mention of the old man, both glanced toward the special chair positioned closest to the fire, where Edmund dozed peacefully, his weathered face relaxed in sleep. Now well into his 8th decade, he had grown increasingly frail physically while his mind remained remarkably sharp, particularly regarding weather patterns and plant knowledge that continued to guide their agricultural decisions. The children gathered extra pine boughs for his bedding, Eliza noted. They remember how those helped during the great winter. The reference needed no elaboration between them. That particular winter had become their family's defining chronological marker. Events were categorized as occurring before, during, or after that extraordinary season of hardship and transformation. Its lessons had permanently altered their approach to everything from food storage to community relationships to seasonal preparations. Their current dwelling reflected these lessons in every detail. The root cellar Thomas had excavated beneath the new storage room maintained perfect temperature for preserving vegetables throughout winter. Carefully designed smoke vents allowed maximum heat retention while minimizing the danger of fire. Multiple, cleverly concealed storage areas throughout the structure housed emergency supplies, distributed strategically rather than concentrated in a single vulnerable location. Beyond physical preparations, the family's social position within the village had evolved significantly following their successful navigation of that challenging winter. Eliza's weaving, once considered merely adequate, had developed into a highly sought-after craft, generating meaningful trade goods. Thomas's innovative agricultural techniques, developed partly through his forced period of observation during recovery, had increased their crop yields sufficiently to allow modest surplus for the first time in their tenant farming experience. Most remarkably, they had established themselves as valuable knowledge resources within the community. Younger families regularly sought their advice regarding winter preparations, building techniques, food preservation, and other survival essentials. Edmund had acquired several informal apprentices who visited regularly to learn traditional weather prediction methods and plant identification skills that formal church education overlooked entirely. The harsh winter that had nearly destroyed them had ultimately catalyzed their transformation from marginal survivors into respected community leaders whose expertise others actively sought. This evolution reflected not merely improved material circumstances, but a fundamental shift in how they understood themselves and their capabilities. A small sound drew Eliza's attention to the sleeping alcove, where Agnes, now 9 and showing remarkable talent for herbalism under Widow Thatcher's tutelage, peered in the doorway. "I had the dream again," she said softly, moving to sit at Eliza's feet. "About the coldest night, when we all thought the roof would collapse." Eliza stroked her daughter's hair, noting how its texture had transformed from baby fineness to the strongest strands of approaching adolescence. "That night taught us important lessons," she replied, continuing her spinning without interruption. "Sometimes we learn most from our greatest challenges." Agnes nodded thoughtfully. Though she retained only fragmented memories of the actual events, Family stories had incorporated that winter-esque experiences into their shared narrative identity. The children born afterward learned these tales as foundational elements of family history, absorbing their embedded lessons about resilience, adaptation, and interdependence. Ned says Lord Blackwood's steward has requested his assistance with mapping the estate boundaries. Agnes mentioned changing subjects with childish fluidity because he draws so accurately from memory. This news, delivered casually, represented another significant transformation resulting from that pivotal winter. Ned, now 13, had developed his early navigational skills into remarkable cartographic abilities that attracted attention beyond village boundaries. His careful observations of landscape features, initially valued merely for locating forageable plants during desperate circumstances, now translated into precise mapping capabilities that local authorities increasingly recognized and rewarded. Similar specialized development had occurred for each family member. William had transformed his temporary interest in fish trapping into sophisticated understanding of waterway ecosystems, providing valuable knowledge for managing the Lord's fish ponds. Agnes demonstrated natural affinity for plant medicine that positioned her as potential successor to aging widow Thatcher as village healer. Even the twins, Thomas and Edmund Jr., named for the men whose partnership had proven so crucial during the Great Winter, already showed distinct personalities and capabilities that received nurturing guidance rather than standardized expectations. The steward offers payment in salt for Ned's assistance, Thomas added, having overheard Agnes's comment. A valuable trade indeed. Eliza nodded agreement, recognizing both the material value of such compensation and the significant social recognition it represented. Their son, born to tenant farming with limited prospects beyond following his father's path, had developed specialized knowledge sufficiently valued to command premium exchange from manorial authorities. As Agnes drifted back to sleep beside the fire, Thomas settled on the bench next to Eliza, their shoulders touching in comfortable familiarity. Outside, wind intensified, driving snow against their windows in audible patterns that once would have triggered immediate anxiety about structural integrity and heat retention. Now, with abundant firewood properly stored, walls appropriately reinforced, and food reserves carefully maintained, such weather represented inconvenience rather than existential threat. I was thinking today about how differently we live now, Thomas said quietly, watching flames dance across well-seasoned oak logs. Not merely in physical comfort, though that certainly matters, but in how we understand ourselves and our place within the larger world. Eliza's hands continued their rhythmic work with the spinning, but her attention focused fully on her husband's reflective mood. Such philosophical observations had become increasingly characteristic of Thomas since that transformative winter, another unexpected development from circumstances that might easily have embittered rather than enlarged his perspective. Before that winter, I measured worth primarily through physical labor, he continued. A good day meant maximum exertion, producing visible results. Now I recognize so many different forms of contribution, each valuable in its particular context. Eliza nodded, understanding immediately the deeper significance of his observation. We learn to value what each person brings naturally rather than forcing all into the same pattern, she agreed. Like recognizing different crops require different soils rather than insisting all must grow in identical conditions. This agricultural metaphor reflected their evolved understanding of human development as well as farming practice. Their children received guidance aligned with their individual capacities, rather than rigid conformity to prescribed roles. Their own relationship had transformed from traditional hierarchy toward genuine partnership that recognized complementary strengths and shared authority. "I wonder sometimes," Thomas mused, watching Edmund's peaceful sleeping form, "how many generations before us learnt similar lessons through winter's harsh teaching, then failed to pass that wisdom forward when abundance returned." This question touched the heart of their family's ongoing commitment to remembrance. Unlike many neighbors who preferred forgetting difficult times once immediate danger passed, they had intentionally incorporated their winter experiences into regular family discussions. Annual rituals marked key anniversaries. The night Walter and John repaired their roof, the day Widow Collins joined their household, the afternoon they successfully salvaged materials from the abandoned cottage. Each commemoration reinforced essential lessons about interdependence, creative adaptation, and community reciprocity. "Our children will remember," Eliza assured him with quiet certainty, "not merely through stories, but through how we continue living the understanding winter taught us." Outside, the night deepened toward its coldest hours, wind moaning around their sturdy dwelling like a distant echo of that desperate season half a decade past. Inside, firelight illuminated their transformed home, where physical comfort reflected deeper changes in how this family understood themselves and their relationship to both natural world and human community. The winter that had nearly destroyed them had ultimately initiated their most significant growth, not merely in material circumstance, but in wisdom, perspective, and authentic human connection. This paradoxical gift continued bearing fruit through each generation, its essential lessons woven permanently into their family identity. Resilience emerges from vulnerability acknowledged. Strength develops through limitations confronted, and genuine security depends less on individual self-sufficiency than on relationships, nurtured through both abundance and scarcity. As Eliza's spinning wheel continued its rhythmic motion, creating usable thread from raw fibers, just as their family had transformed harsh experience into lasting wisdom, the night's deepening cold remained firmly outside their walls for its power, but no longer feared as an insurmountable adversary. Winter would always test human endurance and preparation, but this particular family, shaped by survival through its harshest expression, had discovered capacities within themselves and connections between themselves that transcended mere resistance to cold. They had learned winter's deepest lesson, that human flourishing emerges not from avoiding life's harshest seasons, but from moving through them with awareness, adaptability, and unwavering commitment to one another's well-being. In this understanding lay genuine security that neither freezing temperatures nor material scarcity could fundamentally threaten the resilient human spirit's remarkable capacity for finding warmth even in the coldest seasons of existence. Finn